They didn't come for the painting. They came for what was inside it. Three men in black tactical gear stormed the Chicago Museum of Art Conservation Lab at 11:47 p.m., moving with the kind of precision that doesn't come from a security manual. It comes from someone who has done this before and left no witnesses. Vivian Hale was still at her workbench when the first one kicked the door open. She had her UV lamp in one hand and a century of someone else's secrets in the other, and she had exactly 4 seconds to decide what kind of person she was going to be tonight. She'd spent her whole career restoring what other people had broken. She had no idea she was about to become the thing that needed saving. If this were happening to you, if everything you thought was quiet and safe suddenly had men with guns walking through it, what would you do? Stay with this story. Because what Vivian found inside that painting didn't just change her life. It cracked open a conspiracy that powerful men have been burying for decades. And the person who pulled her out of that alley wasn't a cop, wasn't a hero. He was something far more dangerous and far more complicated than either of those things. Hit that like button if you're already hooked. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because I promise you, the wedding hasn't even started yet. The painting arrived on a Tuesday, which Vivian would later think was a deeply ordinary day for something that catastrophic. It came in a climate-controlled crate from the estate of a deceased collector in Evanston, donated anonymously to the museum with a single condition attached to the paperwork: no public exhibition for 18 months. The estate's attorney had cited family sensitivity in the transfer documents, and the curatorial team had accepted this without much pushback because the work itself, a mid-17th century Dutch oil on panel, unsigned but attributed to a minor follower of Rembrandt, was genuinely significant, not earth-shattering, but significant. Vivian signed for it herself because her assistant Marcus had called in sick and because she was the kind of person who preferred to handle things she cared about with her own hands rather than delegate them to someone who might set it down wrong. She was 41 years old. She had a master's degree in conservation science from the Art Institute, 12 years of institutional experience, and a one-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park that she shared with a rescue cat named after a Baroque composer. She had no romantic prospects she was willing to discuss with her mother, a standing Saturday lunch date with her colleague Denise that she kept because it was the 1 hour of the week nobody needed anything from her, and a reputation in the field for being the person you called when something seemed wrong with a painting that everyone else had already certified as fine. She was not supposed to be at the lab past 7. She was there past 11 because something was wrong with the painting that everyone else had already certified as fine. It had started with the varnish. On initial intake inspection, the surface read as consistent with the attributed period, darkened, slightly yellowed, unrestored. The craquelure pattern was correct. The pigment distribution under raking light was consistent. The infrared reflectography showed pentimento, an artist's mid-work correction, that Vivian found genuinely interesting. But when she ran the initial UV scan, something in the lower right quadrant of the panel came back wrong. Not wrong like damaged, wrong like intentional. She'd sent the rest of the intake team home at 6 and sat with it for 4 hours because she didn't know what she was looking at yet, and she refused to write a report about something she didn't understand. The UV lamp she was using was her personal one, a higher intensity research model she'd bought with her own money because the museum's standard issue equipment was adequate and she'd never found adequate to be enough. She moved it slowly across the lower third of the panel, the black light washing the surface in cold blue-white, watching the varnish fluoresce its characteristic green-yellow. Old repairs showed as dark patches. Overpainting showed as flat, non-fluorescing zones. What she found in the lower right corner showed as neither. It was text, extremely small, applied in a medium that fluoresced distinctly under UV. Not the same compound as the surrounding varnish, not the same period signature as the rest of the work. Someone had written inside this painting, not on the surface, inside it, beneath a layer of overpainting that had then been aged and varnished to match the surrounding original. She leaned closer. Her breath fogged slightly in the temperature-controlled air. The text was encrypted. Columns of numbers, abbreviated names, strings of what looked like account designations, and cargo references. It covered an area roughly the size of a paperback novel. Someone had turned the lower quadrant of a 17th century Dutch panel painting into a ledger. Vivian set down the UV lamp. She picked up her phone. She looked at the time. She put the phone back down and kept working. The first call she should have made was to her department director. She knew that. She didn't make it because her department director was a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had never once in 12 years listened to her assessment of a problem before forming his own opinion about it. And she didn't want Gerald's opinion forming on top of hers before she understood what she was actually looking at. She photographed everything under UV. She photographed everything under visible light. She started a chain of custody notation in her private lab log and time-stamped every image. She was cross-referencing the number strings against publicly available Swiss banking format prefixes. She'd done enough provenance research on looted European art to have that reference memorized. When the door to the conservation lab opened, she didn't look up immediately because the lab had keycard access, and the only people with access after hours were senior conservation staff and building security. She assumed Marcus had recovered from whatever was wrong with him and come back for something he'd forgotten. The first indication that this was not Marcus was the sound. 3 sets of footsteps, moving too evenly, too deliberately, with none of the incidental noise that a person who belongs somewhere makes when they walk through a familiar space. Vivian looked up. 3 men. Black tactical clothing. No visible insignia. The one in front had already covered half the distance between the door and her workbench, and he was looking not at her but at the painting. Step away from the panel. His voice was flat, accented in a way she couldn't immediately place. Eastern European, she thought, with something else underneath it. Step away and put your hands where I can see them. Vivian did not step away. Later, she would not be able to fully explain why. The decision didn't feel like courage in the moment. It felt more like the way her body simply refused to comply with something that was fundamentally wrong. This is a restricted conservation lab, she said. You don't have authorization to be in this space. The man in front stopped. He looked at her for the first time, and something moved across his face that she recognized much later as the specific irritation of someone who has planned for all the reasonable responses and is now dealing with an unreasonable one. Last time, he said, step away from the panel. The man behind him and to his left was already reaching for the painting. Vivian grabbed the UV lamp and swung it into the panel. She didn't think about it. She thought about it later, extensively, in the way you think about a decision your body made before your brain caught up to it. And what she understood was that some part of her had processed the situation and concluded that whatever was in that painting was more dangerous in their hands than it was destroyed. She'd spent her career restoring what other people had broken, and she'd just broken something irreplaceable, and her hands were shaking with the full understanding of that, even as the panel cracked. The man in front of her moved. She ran. The lab had 2 exits, the main door behind the men, and a secondary emergency corridor that connected to the service wing at the north end of the building. Vivian had walked that corridor exactly once during her initial building orientation, and she ran it now from memory and the muscle knowledge of the floor plan she'd spent 12 years absorbing. Behind her, she could hear them, and she did not look back because looking back is for people who have the luxury of curiosity about what's following them. She hit the stairwell door. She went down. She went out through the loading dock exit and into the alley behind the museum, and the rain hit her like a cold hand, soaking her through in the 30 seconds it took her to understand that she had nowhere to go. She'd left her coat inside. She had her phone. She had the memory card from her camera, which she'd pulled and pocketed by pure reflex before she ran. She had the UV lamp in her hand, which was absurd and heavy, and she couldn't remember deciding to keep holding it. She pressed herself against the dumpster at the alley's dead end and called 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. Vivian gave the address, gave her name, said there were armed men inside the museum. The dispatcher told her to stay on the line and stay in place. She stayed on the line. She did not stay in place because 30 seconds after the call, the loading dock door opened and 2 of the 3 men came out. Vivian moved deeper into the alley. It dead-ended in a chain-link fence, and the men were between her and the street, and she was calculating the fence. Too tall, wet, she'd lose time, when a dark car came from somewhere and stopped at the alley's mouth and a man got out. He was tall, dark coat. He walked into the alley with the same quality of deliberateness she'd noticed in the men from the lab, but different. The men from the lab had moved with purpose. This man moved with something closer to ownership, like the space was rearranging itself around him rather than the other way around. He said 3 words to the men from the lab. She couldn't hear what they were. She could hear the tone, which was soft, and the effect, which was immediate. Both men stopped moving. Then he looked at Vivian. "Ms. Hale." His voice carried the distance between them with no effort, not loud, just clear. "Come with me." "I'm not going anywhere with you." Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. Her hands were still shaking. "I have the police on the phone." "You do?" He didn't seem troubled by this. "And they'll arrive in approximately 11 minutes, at which point the men behind me will be long gone, and you will have no evidence of anything that happened inside that building tonight, because the panel you destroyed is already being removed through the North Service entrance." He paused. "You have something they still want, something you took from the lab, and they will not stop coming for it because you involved the police. They will simply be more patient." Vivian stared at him. Rain was running down the back of her neck. Her UV lamp was dripping. "Who are you?" she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. "My name is Lucien Moretti." She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago with a passing awareness of the city's criminal geography knew the name. What she hadn't known, what no photograph she'd ever seen had prepared her for, was the specific quality of stillness in him. Standing in a rain-soaked alley with two men behind him and a woman who'd just smashed a priceless painting in front of him, he looked less like a person reacting to events and more like a person who'd already seen all of this and was working from a script he'd written in advance. "You're the Moretti family," she said. "Yes." "Those men work for your family." "No." Something sharpened in his expression. "Those men came here tonight to destroy evidence that implicates my family. There is a difference." The dispatcher was still talking in her earpiece. She'd forgotten she was still on the call. She pulled the phone down and looked at it. Lucian watched her. He didn't move. He didn't rush her. "You said they want something I took," Vivian said. "How do you know what I took?" "Because I know what was inside that painting," he said. "And because you're still alive, which means you moved it before they got to you, which means you understood what you were looking at." Vivian thought about the memory card in her pocket. She thought about the columns of numbers, the abbreviated names, the strings she'd been cross-referencing against Swiss banking formats. She thought about what it meant that Lucien Moretti was standing in this alley, in the rain, talking to her in that tone of absolute calm certainty, and the thing she thought was, he's scared. Not the way ordinary people are scared, the way people who never show fear look when the thing they've been managing for a long time has started to get ahead of them. Something in the set of his jaw, something in the precision of his words, like a man who is choosing everyone very carefully because he can't afford to choose wrong. "What do you want from me?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. Rain ran down the lines of his face. He said, "I need you to come with me tonight. I need what you have. And I need—" He paused, and it was a real pause, the kind with actual weight behind it. "I need a date for my brother's wedding." Vivian blinked. She was certain she'd misheard him. "I'm sorry." "My brother's wedding, Saturday. It's a formal event. There will be people there who need to see me arrive with a certain continuity of normal life. People who cannot know that anything is wrong." He looked at her steadily. "You are an art conservator. You are credible. You are clearly capable of operating under pressure, and you're already involved in this whether you want to be or not." "You are absolutely insane," Vivian said. "Probably," he said. "But I'm also the only reason you're still standing here instead of in the back of a van headed somewhere you'd never be found. So," he held out his hand, "come with me, Ms. Hale. We'll figure out the rest." Sirens somewhere, 10 blocks north, moving closer. The two men behind him were watching her with the patient blankness of people who were waiting for someone else to make a decision. Vivian looked at Lucien Moretti's outstretched hand. She thought about her father, who had spent the last 23 years carrying the weight of something that hadn't been his fault, a ruin she'd watched happen from the outside and never understood the shape of. She thought about the numbers she'd photographed, the names she'd half-decoded, the cargo references that matched routes she'd seen in provenance documentation for looted European artwork that moved through Chicago in the late 90s and never quite got explained. She put the UV lamp down. It clanged against the wet asphalt. She took his hand. His grip was firm and dry and completely steady, and if her own hand was still shaking, he gave no sign of noticing, which was either courtesy or calculation, and she was going to have to figure out which before she trusted him any further than this alley. The car was already moving before she had a chance to look back at the museum. Through the rear window, over the line of the seat, she caught one last glimpse of the building before it disappeared. The lit windows of the conservation lab, still burning in the dark, with no one inside now but the wreckage of something that couldn't be restored. She turned forward. Lucien Moretti sat across from her. He was looking at something on his phone, face tilted slightly down, jaw set. He had dark circles under his eyes that his expression was working very hard to deny. "The wedding," she said. "Your brother. What's his name?" "Marco." He didn't look up. "And he doesn't know any of this is happening." "Marco knows very little of what happens in our family," Lucien said, with a flatness that was not cruelty, but was something adjacent to it. "By design. I have spent the better part of 15 years making sure of it." Vivian looked at him for a moment. "That sounds exhausting." He did look up then. She had the sense she'd surprised him, though he didn't show it except in a slight recalibration behind his eyes. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they thought they understood and have just realized they don't. "It is," he said. And then, "The memory card. May I see it?" She thought about it. She thought about the fence she hadn't been able to climb, and the dispatcher's voice still warm in her memory, and the men who had come to a museum at midnight to destroy a painting rather than steal it, which was a particular kind of desperate she recognized from provenance cases, where the alternative to destruction was exposure. She took the card from her pocket. She held it between two fingers. "I want to know everything," she said. "Not the version you've decided I need to know. Everything." He looked at the card. He looked at her. He said, "That's going to take some time." "Then start now." He held out his hand. She gave him the card. Outside, Chicago moved past the windows in wet orange light, the city going about its night around the edges of whatever this was. And Vivian Hale sat very straight in the back of a stranger's car and tried to remember the last time she'd felt this certain that she'd just made either the best or the worst decision of her life. She couldn't remember. That, probably, was the problem. The memory card was the size of a thumbnail and contained Lucien. Lucien told her enough information to get both of them killed before sunrise. He said it the way someone states a weather forecast. Not dramatically, just factually, the way a person talks when they've been living inside dangerous information long enough that the danger has stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like weather. Vivian sat across from him in the back of the car and watched him slot the memory card into a reader connected to a tablet that had no manufacturer logo she recognized and a lock screen that required both a fingerprint and a 6-digit code. She'd photographed everything she found under the UV lamp. She'd done it systematically, the way she documented condition reports. Frame by frame, overlapping fields, consistent exposure. Whatever was on that card was complete. Lucien looked at the first image for a long time without speaking. The driver, a broad-shouldered man named Soren, who had not been introduced but whose name Lucien had used once in a clipped instruction about the route, navigated through the wet streets without asking for direction. He knew where he was going. Vivian filed that away. This car, this route, this destination had been prepared before Lucien arrived at that alley. He hadn't improvised this. He'd planned for it. "You recognize this format," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How long have you known it existed?" He scrolled to the next image. His jaw moved slightly, the way people's jaws move when they're doing arithmetic they don't want witnessed. "I knew something existed. I didn't know what form it took." He paused on an image, a dense column of numbers and 2-letter country codes. "I didn't know it was inside a painting." "Whose painting was it originally?" "A man named Callum Reese." He said it without looking up. "He's been dead for 4 years. Heart attack, officially." "And unofficially?" Lucien did look up then. He studied her for a moment with the specific quality of attention she was starting to identify as his default mode. Complete, measuring, giving nothing back until he'd decided what it was worth. "Unofficially," he said, "Callum Reese was the accountant for a joint operation between my family and the Doyle Syndicate out of South Boston. And he had been, for approximately 2 decades, keeping a second set of books that neither my father nor Ronan Doyle knew existed." Vivian absorbed this. How was documenting both organizations? Everything. Every transaction, every shipment, every arrangement. Encoded, but encoded by a man who was an accountant, not a cryptographer. He set the tablet down, meaning it's breakable. I was already breaking it, Vivian said. In the lab, before they came. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise. Something more like the recalculation of an estimate. How far did you get? The numerical prefixes in the left column match a routing format used by 3 specific Swiss correspondent banks that were flagged in a 2003 European Commission investigation into wartime restitution claims. I've worked provenance cases that touch that same network. She watched his expression carefully. The cargo references in column 4 are consistent with shipping manifests I've seen on looted artwork that moved through Great Lakes ports between 1997 and 2004, and the abbreviated names in the right margin. She paused. 2 of them match surnames I recognize from a Moretti family trust document that was part of a civil forfeiture case in 2009. It was public record. I looked it up once for a provenance chain. Lucien was very still. You did all of that, he said. In 4 hours, alone, after hours. I'm good at my job. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, the name's in the right margin. How many did you recognize? 2 with confidence, a third possibly. She held his gaze. One of them wasn't a Moretti name. Tell me. Brennan. She watched him. The abbreviation was BRNV with a series of dates running from 1999 to 2017. Consistent entry pattern, same column position as the family trust names, which suggests equivalent organizational standing. She paused. That's not an Irish name, and it's not a Moretti name, so whoever BRNV is, they're a third party with 18 years of involvement in whatever this ledger documents. The car was quiet for a moment, except for the rain against the glass and the sound of the city moving outside. Soren's eyes appeared briefly in the rearview mirror, then moved back to the road. Lucien picked the tablet back up. He scrolled slowly through the images, and Vivian watched his face, and what she saw was a man encountering confirmation of something he had feared without knowing its specific shape. It was a particular kind of dread, the dread of finally seeing the thing you'd spent years trying not to look at directly. BRNV, he said quietly, is my uncle. His name, Lucien explained, was Vincent Brennan Moretti. He'd taken his mother's maiden name professionally for reasons the family had accepted without much examination, because Vincent was the kind of man who generated explanations that satisfied on the surface and were never quite examined underneath. He was 63. He had been the family's chief operations coordinator for 27 years. He was the person, Lucien said, with the flat tone of a man describing a structural fault in a building he lived in, who had managed the relationship with the Doyle Syndicate from its inception. He built it, Lucien said, the whole arrangement. He brought Ronan Doyle to my father in 1998 and presented it as an opportunity. Expanded distribution networks, shared infrastructure, mutual protection agreements. He stopped. My father trusted him completely. And you? I inherited the trust, he said, along with everything else. They arrived at a building in River North that Vivian identified as a private residential address. No business signage, underground parking entrance, the particular featureless discretion of serious money trying not to be noticed. Soren pulled into the garage and cut the engine, and Vivian followed Lucien into an elevator that required a key, not a button. The apartment was on the 14th floor. It was large, spare, and looked like a place where someone slept and thought and ate without making it a home. Good furniture, but impersonal. No photographs on the walls. A kitchen that was clean in the way a kitchen is clean when it's never used. The one exception was a long table against the west wall covered in documents, maps, and printed photographs, a working surface that had the organic disorder of something built up over time rather than arranged. Vivian walked toward it before she'd consciously decided to. Don't, Lucien started. She was already looking. I'm not going to touch anything. I'm just looking. He stopped. He watched her look. The documents on the table were a mixture of shipping records, financial summaries, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. The photographs showed a warehouse district she didn't immediately recognize, a series of men in various settings, restaurants, parking lots, the entrance to what looked like a private airport terminal, and in a manila folder she tilted open with one finger, a photograph of herself. She turned around. That's from 2 weeks ago, Lucien said. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. You were consulting on a provenance dispute for a private collector in Gold Coast. The collector has connections to the Doyle family. You've been watching me. I've been watching everyone connected to the collector. He pushed off the doorframe. You were incidental. Until tonight. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to be accurate, he said. I'm not going to insult you with comfort right now. You're too smart for it. And I don't have the energy. She looked at the photograph of herself, standing outside a Streeterville townhouse, leather bag over one shoulder, looking down at her phone. She looked small in it, ordinary, completely unaware. How long have you been building this? She said, gesturing at the table. 8 months. He moved to the table and stood beside her, looking at it, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his posture that his face was trained to hide. Since Marco announced the engagement and I started thinking about the guest list and understood that certain people would use the wedding as a convergence point. For what? For a transfer of authority, he said. My uncle has been positioning for it for 2 years. I didn't see it until recently. And when I started seeing it, I started understanding that the ledger, whatever form it took, wherever Callum hid it, was the mechanism. The proof of what Vincent has been building in parallel to everything we thought we were running. He looked at her. He hasn't been serving this family. He's been running his own operation inside ours, using our infrastructure, our relationships, our name, to build something that eventually won't need us anymore. Vivian thought about this. She thought about the photograph of herself. She thought about her father. Dominic Hale, she said. Lucian went very still. My father, she said. I was a shipping consultant in the late 90s and early 2000s. He had a federal investigation open on him in 2003 for allegedly facilitating the movement of undeclared cargo through Great Lakes ports. He was never charged, but the investigation destroyed his reputation and his career, and he never recovered. She kept her voice even, with the particular effort of someone who has been keeping their voice even about this for 23 years. If those cargo references in the ledger are what I think they are, he was used as a front. Someone used his consulting credentials and his port contacts to move those shipments, and when the investigation got close, they let him take the weight of it. Lucian's expression was doing several things at once. You think your father is in those records? I think the evidence that exonerates my father is in those records, she said. And I think whoever was running those shipments needed a civilian face on the logistics. And my father was convenient, and when they were done with him, they made sure he looked guilty enough that nobody looked any further. She looked at him steadily. So when you say you want my help decoding that ledger, you need to understand that I am not a neutral party. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. You're not. He pulled out a chair from the table and sat down. Neither am I. Sit down, Ms. Hale. This is going to take most of the night. She sat. They worked until 4 in the morning. Vivian decoded and Lucian identified, and what emerged from the ledger was not a simple accounting of criminal enterprise, but something with more layers and more patience than either of them had fully anticipated. A parallel organization built inside the Moretti family structure over nearly 2 decades, with its own cash flows, its own contacts, its own arrangement with the Doyle syndicate that differed significantly from the arrangement the Moretti family believed existed. Vincent Brennan Moretti had been running 2 relationships simultaneously, the official one, which he managed and reported and kept functional, and the private one, which he'd been quietly deepening in ways that were designed to make the Doyle alliance eventually disposable to him and the Moretti alliance eventually replaceable. He wasn't working for the Doyles, he wasn't working for the Morettis, he was working for himself, and he'd been doing it long enough and carefully enough that he was nearly ready to stop pretending otherwise. The wedding, Vivian said, at 3:47 in the morning. She'd taken off her wet jacket 2 hours ago and was working in her shirt, hair pulled back with a pen, because she'd had a pen but no hair tie. The coffee Lucian had made at 2 a.m. had gone cold. That's the timeline, isn't it? The wedding is when he moves. The shipping terminal. Lucian had a city map spread across one section of the table and was marking points on it with a pencil. There's a reference in the ledger to an incoming shipment, delivery window of Friday night to Saturday morning. While every significant member of the family and the Doyle organization is gathered in one place with their attention on Marco's wedding, he set the pencil down. The shipment finances the transfer. Whatever he's built in parallel gets funded and legitimized in a 48-hour window during which no one is in a position to respond. What's in the shipment? Lucian looked at the map. The ledger calls it repositioned assets. Based on the cargo weights and the manifest codes, he looked at her. Artwork. Significant volume. High value. Vivian felt something cold move through her. Looted artwork used as currency. Untraceable. Internationally liquid. Worth more than cash in the right markets. He looked at her. Exactly what you've spent 12 years tracking through the legitimate world. She thought about provenance chains. She thought about the gap years, the missing documentation, the works that surfaced in one country after decades of absence with paperwork that was technically complete and fundamentally false. She'd flagged 3 works in the past 2 years that hadn't gone anywhere because she couldn't prove what she suspected, and the owners had lawyers. She thought about those 3 works now with a specific, nauseating clarity. I need to see the terminal, she said. Absolutely not. The manifest codes in the ledger use a warehousing notation system that was specific to a particular freight broker that went out of business in 2006. I know that system. I've worked cases that touched it. She looked at him. You can read numbers. I can read what the numbers are describing. There's a difference. He looked at her with the expression of a man who knows he's about to agree to something he'll regret, and is taking a moment to resent it before he does. The terminal is not safe. The museum wasn't safe either, Vivian said. I was there anyway. That was before you knew what you were involved in. I knew enough. She held his gaze. You said you need what I have. You meant the memory card. But you also need what I know, and what I know is in my head, not on a card. So either I'm involved or I'm not. You don't get to use half of me. Silence. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does at 4 in the morning in the rain, existing without apology, indifferent to the specific scale of whatever was being decided inside any given room. Saturday is 5 days away, Lucien said. Then we have 5 days. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, the wedding is formal. You'll need something appropriate to wear. I will deal with my own wardrobe, Vivian said. Something that was almost amusement moved briefly across his face and disappeared before it could be identified as such. He made her take the second bedroom. It was spare and clean and had a view of the river, which was dark and moving and not particularly comforting at 4:15 in the morning. He gave her a phone, a clean one, he said, meaning untraceable, with 3 numbers programmed into it, his, Soren's, and a third he identified only as medical. She didn't ask about the third number. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about her father sitting in his apartment in Evanston, 12 miles north, sleeping the sleep of a man who had given up expecting things to change. She thought about the way he'd stopped talking about what happened by the time she was 20, not because he'd made peace with it, but because he'd run out of energy to carry it and talk at the same time. She thought about the look on his face the one time she'd brought it up directly. Her, 34 years old, sitting across from him at his kitchen table with a folder of documents she'd spent 2 months pulling from federal archives, and the way he'd looked at the folder and then at her and said, very quietly, "Don't, Vivian. You don't know what you're looking at." She'd assumed then that he meant the complexity of the case. She understood now that he meant the danger of it. She didn't sleep. At 6:30, she heard movement in the apartment, and she got up and found Lucien at the kitchen counter, already dressed, with coffee made and the tablet open to the ledger images. He looked like a man who hadn't slept either and was declining to acknowledge it. He pushed a mug toward her without ceremony. "Marco's fiancée," he said without preamble. "Her name is Elena Vasquez. Her family is from Miami. Her father is a legitimate businessman. Construction, real estate, nothing flagged. She's a tax attorney." He looked at Vivian. "She is entirely innocent of everything connected to this family, and I will not have her wedding destroyed." Vivian wrapped both hands around the mug. "I understand." "I need you to understand it specifically," he said. "Not generally. Marco has spent his life outside of this world because I made sure of it. He is marrying a woman he loves in 5 days, and I am going to stand beside him when he does it. And everything else, all of this, happens around that, not through it." There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not hardness, the opposite of hardness. A place that wasn't armored. "You love your brother," Vivian said. He looked at the tablet. "I would prefer not to be obvious about it." She almost smiled. She stopped herself because it felt like the wrong moment, and also because she wasn't sure yet that she'd earned the right to find him human. "Tell me about the wedding guests," she said. "Who will be there that I need to know about?" He walked her through it over the next 90 minutes. Names, relationships, organizational positions, the specific tensions and alliances she'd need to navigate without appearing to navigate them. He was thorough and precise, and occasionally, when he landed on someone he had genuine contempt for, a particular dryness entered his voice that was the closest thing to personality she'd seen from him unguarded. At 8:15, his phone rang. He looked at it. Something shifted in his face. "I need to take this," he said, and walked to the far end of the room. Vivian sat with her coffee and didn't try to hear what he was saying, but she could hear the tone of it, clipped, controlled, with one specific moment of something that cracked before he caught it. He was on for 4 minutes. When he came back, he set the phone face down on the counter and stood with his hands on the edge of the counter and his back to her for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. "Lucien." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He registered it, a slight adjustment in his posture. "What happened?" He turned around. His face was composed again, but it had cost him something to compose it. "That was my family's attorney. The museum has filed an emergency report with the Chicago Police Department regarding last night. They've also contacted their insurers regarding the panel." He paused. The official account of last night, as reported by building security, is that an employee suffered a mental episode, damaged a piece in the conservation collection, and fled the building. Vivian set her mug down. "They're describing me as the perpetrator. There are security camera images. The men who entered the lab are not visible on any of them. The footage from the corridor shows you running, alone, with the UV lamp." He held her gaze. "Your keycard was used to exit the building at 11:52 p.m. The panel was found damaged. You are currently not at your address and not answering your personal phone." She sat very still. "They're going to file charges. Potentially. Or use the threat of charges to control your movements." He watched her. "Either way, you cannot go back to your apartment. You cannot go to the museum. You cannot contact your colleagues or your family without using the phone I gave you." Vivian thought about her cat. She thought about Denise, who would call her cell on Saturday for lunch and not understand why she didn't answer. She thought about her father, who did not know that the thing he'd told her not to look at, she'd looked at anyway, and had found it, and was now sitting in a stranger's apartment, unable to go home. "They set this up last night," she said, "before the men came. They had the camera footage already arranged." "Yes." "Which means whoever sent those men expected me to run, expected me to escape with evidence, and built the cover story in advance." "Yes." She looked at him. "That means they know I have what was in the painting. They know what I can do with it, and they want me discredited before I do anything with it." "Correct." "So your uncle knows you exist," Lucien said, "as of last night." He paused. "Which means we have less time than I thought." Vivian breathed. In, out. The kind of breath you take when you're deciding whether to fall apart or not, and you're deciding not. "The wedding is Saturday," she said. "Yes." "And the shipment arrives Friday night." "Yes." "Then we need to be at that terminal Friday night," she said. "Before the transfer, before your uncle uses it to move." Lucien looked at her. "I told you. I know what you told me." She stood up. "And I told you that you don't get to use half of me. That still applies." She looked at him steadily. "I am a person of interest in a criminal investigation that was specifically designed to silence me. I have nowhere to go and nothing to lose by going forward. You want the ledger decoded, you want the shipment stopped, you want whatever proof exists that your uncle has been running a shadow operation inside your family. You need me inside that terminal." She paused. "So stop calculating whether you can afford to bring me and start figuring out how." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light came through the window at a low angle and caught the lines of his face, and she could see clearly what she'd suspected the night before. This was a man who was accustomed to bearing things alone, and who had absolutely no idea what to do with someone who insisted on standing beside him. "Friday night," he said finally. "We go Friday night." "Good." He nodded, turned back to the tablet, then stopped and said without turning around, "The cat." Vivian blinked. "What?" "You have a cat. I saw it in the surveillance file. Soren can arrange for someone to check on it." She stared at the back of his head. "The surveillance file documented my cat." It documented your household. He pulled up an image on the tablet. Thoroughness is not negotiable in my work. She sat back down. His name is Handel. The composer. The composer. A pause. I'll tell Soren. He went back to the tablet. Vivian looked at her cold coffee and at the map on the table and at the window and at the city outside it, gray and wet and enormous. She thought about the terminal. She thought about Friday night. She thought about the conversation she was going to need to have eventually about her father's name appearing in the same ledger that was about to determine the future of the Moretti organization, and about whether Lucien Moretti, when it came to that moment, was going to see her as a partner or as a complication. She didn't know. She wasn't sure he knew either. At 9:45, she was reviewing the ledger images on a secondary tablet Lucien had set up for her when a knock came at the apartment door. 3 sharp raps, close-spaced, a signal rather than a social gesture. Lucien went to the door himself and opened it without checking the peephole, which told her something about who was on the other side. 2 men came in. The first she didn't recognize, 50s, gray at the temples, the build of someone who used to be physically imposing and had distributed that physicality more broadly over time. He carried a leather folio and moved with the ease of someone who'd been in this apartment before. The second was younger, perhaps 30, dark-featured, and he looked at Vivian the way people look at something they weren't told would be there. Vivian, Lucien said, this is Carmine. He manages our legal affairs. Carmine looked at her with an expression that was professional and completely non-committal. Ms. Hale, and this, Lucien said, with a careful flatness that told her something, is my brother. Marco Moretti was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she'd expected. He was shorter than Lucien by 3 inches, and where Lucien was contained and deliberate, Marco had a quality of physical expressiveness. He moved when he talked, occupied space differently, as if he hadn't been trained out of it. He looked at his brother with the specific combination of affection and exasperation that lives in the muscle memory of siblings who have spent a lifetime performing their assigned roles. He looked at Vivian. Lucien, he said, not taking his eyes off her. Why is there a woman in your apartment who looks like she hasn't slept and is reading documents she probably shouldn't have access to? She's a consultant, Lucien said. A consultant who stayed the night. It's complicated. It always is with you. Marco sat down at the table without being invited, the way someone sits who grew up with equal claim to any chair in any room. He looked at the maps, the documents, the tablet. He looked at his brother. Elena's mother called me this morning. She wants to confirm the floral arrangements. I'll handle it. You won't handle it, because you have no idea what the floral arrangements are, and I'm the one who… Marco stopped. He looked at the maps again more carefully this time. Then he looked at Lucien with an expression that was not the exasperation of moments ago. Luc, don't. Lucien, the wedding is Saturday and it is going to happen, Lucien said, with a quietness that was more absolute than any volume. And you are going to marry Elena, and it is going to be the best day of your life. That is not negotiable, and it is not up for discussion. Do you understand me? Marco looked at him. Something passed between them that was too old and too private for Vivian to read. The kind of communication that exists between people who have been keeping each other's weights for so long that the exchange has become involuntary. Are you in trouble? Marco said. I am handling something, Lucien said. There is a difference. Marco looked at Vivian. Is he in trouble? Vivian looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at her with an expression that was the first fully unguarded thing she'd seen from him. A look that was somewhere between warning and something that wasn't quite a request, but was shaped like one. She looked at Marco. He's handling something, she said. He seems to be good at it. Marco held her gaze for a moment with a directness that reminded her suddenly of his brother. Then he stood up. The floral arrangements are white garden roses and Italian ruscus, he said to Lucien. Elena's mother likes the ones at the main entrance to be significantly taller than everyone else in the room. Don't let her down. He left. Carmine stayed, set his folio on the table, and began laying out documents with the patient efficiency of a man who has spent his career turning bad situations into navigable ones. Vivian looked at the door Marco had closed behind him. He doesn't know, she said. No, Lucien said. He suspects. He has always suspected, Lucien said, with a heaviness that was not guilt but was related to it. and I have always been able to give him enough to settle on without having to give him everything, until now. He turned to the documents Carmine was laying out. Ms. Hale, we need to discuss what happens if we're wrong about the timeline. But she was still looking at the door, and she was thinking about what it costs to protect someone from something for so long that you've made them a stranger to the danger you've been carrying, and what it costs the person being protected, who knows they're being protected but can't see from what, and lives for years in the shape of someone else's carefully maintained lie. She knew that shape. She'd grown up in it. She pulled her chair to the table and looked at the documents and said, "Tell me what you need." And Carmine opened his folio, and outside the rain had finally stopped. And somewhere across the city, in a building that Vivian didn't yet know how to locate, a man named Vincent Brennan Moretti was looking at a report that told him the museum's operation had been only partially successful and was making a new set of calculations about a woman named Vivian Hale and how much damage she could do before Saturday if someone didn't stop her first. Carmine left at noon with a signed document. Vivian didn't fully understand, and a verbal assurance from Lucian that he didn't fully believe, and the apartment settled back into the particular quiet of two people who have been working in close proximity long enough that silence has stopped being awkward and started being functional. They spent Thursday planning. Not the romantic version of planning that happens in films where two people lean over maps and speak in urgent half-sentences and trust blooms naturally from proximity. The real version, which is mostly tedious and frequently contentious and requires a specific willingness to tell another person they're wrong about something they feel certain about and then wait for them to not take it personally. Vivian was wrong twice. She admitted it both times, quickly and without drama, which seemed to recalibrate something in Lucian's assessment of her in a way that was more useful than being right would have been. Lucian was wrong once. He did not admit it for approximately 20 minutes, during which he restated his original position in 3 different formulations while Vivian waited without comment. And then he said, "You may be correct about the secondary access point," in the tone of a man issuing a correction to a legal document, and moved on. She filed this away. By Thursday evening, they had a working map of the terminal facility, an abandoned freight and cold storage complex on the southwestern edge of the port district that Carmine had sourced through property records, cross-referenced by Vivian against warehousing notations, in the ledger that matched the facility's historical freight designations. The terminal had been decommissioned in 2008, officially condemned in 2011, and had been sitting in the ownership of a shell company that Vivian traced through 4 layers of incorporation before hitting a name that made her stop typing. She turned the tablet around and showed it to Lucian. He looked at the name on the screen. He looked at it for long enough that she knew he recognized it. Then he said, "That's Carmine's firm." "The holding company is registered to an attorney of record at Carmine's firm," Vivian said carefully. "Not Carmine himself, a junior partner, but that's the same firm." His voice was flat. "Yes. It could be coincidence. Large firms handle a lot of corporate registrations." "It could be," Lucian said. He picked up his phone and held it for a moment without using it. Then he set it back down. "Don't mention this to Soren." "I wasn't going to mention it to anyone." He looked at her. "Good." He didn't call Carmine. He didn't explain why, and she didn't ask, because the answer was clear enough. When you discover that the ground under a specific point might be compromised, you don't test it by walking directly onto it. You note it. You route around it. You keep moving. They kept moving. Friday arrived the way bad days arrive in Chicago in October. Gray from the moment the dark lifted, with a cold that had teeth in it, and a wind off the lake that moved through clothing like it had an agenda. Vivian stood at the apartment window at 6:15 in the morning and watched the city materialize out of the dark, and thought about the terminal, and about what would be arriving there tonight, and about what she and Lucien were planning to do about it, which was a plan she would not have described as good, but would have described as necessary, and sometimes necessary is the only category available. Lucien was already at the table. He'd slept 3 hours, she could tell because the specific depth of the exhaustion under his eyes had lightened fractionally, the way exhaustion does when you've given it the minimum it needs to stop actively impeding function. He had coffee ready. He pushed a cup toward her without looking up. "The wedding rehearsal is at 2, he said. I need to be there." "I know." "Which means we have until 1:30. "I know." She sat down. "How do we get into the terminal?" Soren found a maintenance access point on the eastern perimeter. There's a gap in the fence line where a section collapsed and was never repaired. The shell company that owns it has been deliberately delaying any maintenance work. Keeps people out, officially. Unofficially, it means there are no cameras on the eastern approach. How does Soren know about the fence? He went last night. Vivian absorbed this. Alone. He does this kind of work, Lucian said. He's done it for 12 years. And you trust him? Differently than I trusted Carmine, Lucian said, which was not quite an answer but was precise enough to function as one. She trusted Soren differently too, by the end of it. The trust that comes not from knowing someone well but from watching how they move through risk, whether they're careful or reckless, whether they think or react. What she'd observed of Soren suggested someone who thought first and moved second, which was more than she could say for most people she'd worked with in 12 years of institutional conservation, where the standard approach to a problem was to form a committee and wait for the problem to become undeniable. They left for the terminal at 10:15. Soren drove. The city moved around them in Friday morning traffic. Ordinary people going to ordinary places, the particular density of the working day assembling itself around them with complete indifference. And Vivian sat in the back with the laminated facility map across her knees and thought about the shipping manifest codes she'd memorized from the ledger and what they would look like in physical form. She was about to find out. The terminal was worse than the photographs. Photographs can't communicate smell, and what the abandoned facility smelled like was 2 decades of salt water, diesel, and rot with something chemical underneath it that Vivian's body registered as wrong before her mind identified it as the particular compound smell of improperly stored solvents, the kind used in cleaning and conditioning certain types of materials, the kind used in preparing artwork for transport. The fence gap was where Soren had said it was. The three of them moved through it single file in the gray morning, Lucian first, then Vivian, then Soren, and the terminal closed around them with the specific quality of a space that has been empty for a long time and knows it. The main warehouse structure was a steel and concrete building approximately 200 feet long and 50 feet wide, with loading bay doors along the southern face, 4 of them. The tracks corroded but the mechanisms recently oiled, which Vivian noted because that's the kind of thing conservation training makes visible. The difference between organic deterioration and maintained function. Someone had been maintaining those loading bay mechanisms recently. Someone intended to use them. They found the crates in the 3rd interior section, past a collapsed shelving system, and a rusted forklift that had been there long enough to become architectural. The crates were stacked against the north wall in a configuration that was clearly preparatory, arranged for loading, not storage, with spacing for access on all sides and a clear path to the nearest loading bay. Vivian counted 47 crates of varying dimensions. The smallest were the size of a large suitcase. The largest were 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, the dimensions used for large format canvases or unframed panels. She knew those dimensions. She'd signed hundreds of condition reports for objects shipped in exactly those dimensions. "This is already here," she said. "The shipment didn't arrive last night. It's been here." Lucian and Soren were already moving along the row of crates. "Some of it," Lucian said. The ledger referenced an incoming component. The balance of the collection was already in place. "How long?" "Based on the dust displacement patterns." He glanced at Soren, who said, with the brevity of a man who measures things carefully, "Some of these have been here 6 months, at least." 6 months. Vivian looked at the crates and felt the calculation happening in her chest. The scope of what had been assembled here, how long it had taken, how many separate transactions, how many compromised professionals, how many forged provenance documents had made this possible. A collection this size didn't materialize in weeks. It had been built the way the rest of Vincent's operation had been built, slowly, patiently, over years, under cover of everything else that was happening around it. She moved to the nearest crate. It was sealed with commercial shipping hardware, the kind that requires specific tools to open without damage, but the manifest tag attached to the exterior was readable. She photographed it. She moved to the next one and photographed that. She worked down the row with the focused efficiency of someone who has processed hundreds of intake situations, and what she was reading in the manifest tags was a geography of theft that covered 8 countries and 3 decades. "Lucian." She stopped at a crate near the center of the arrangement. The manifest tag on this one was different, newer hardware, different shipping label format, and below the standard tag, tucked partially under the strapping, was a secondary document in a transparent sleeve. She pulled it free carefully. It was a chain of custody record. Private, not institutional. The format used by high-end dealers and private collectors rather than museums. She unfolded it. The object described was a large format oil on canvas, early 19th century, listed as having been in the collection of a private European family until 1943, after which the record showed a gap of 51 years before reappearing in a private sale in Geneva in 1994. She knew this gap. She'd seen it in her own research files. 51 years, 1943 to 1994, was the specific gap profile of wartime seizure. Works taken from Jewish families during the occupation of France and the Low Countries, which then moved through a network of intermediary sales before surfacing in the post-war market with reconstructed provenance that was technically plausible and fundamentally dishonest. But what stopped her breathing was not the gap. It was the name at the bottom of the 1994 sale record. The purchaser. Dominic Hale. Her father's name. In her father's handwriting. She knew it the way she knew her own, having grown up watching it on grocery lists and birthday cards and the backs of photographs, signing as the purchasing agent for a collector she didn't recognize. Her hands were completely steady. She was distantly aware of this as a physiological fact, separate from everything else happening inside her, the way you notice peripheral details when the central thing is too large to process directly. Vivian. Lucien was beside her. He'd moved without her hearing him. He was looking at the document in her hands. What is it? She showed him. He read it. His expression did not change in any way she could identify, which was itself a kind of information. He read it a second time. Then he said, "When did your father stop working as a consulting agent?" 2003, when the federal investigation opened. Her voice was her own. She was surprised by this. He'd been a purchasing and logistics agent for private collectors since the early 90s. He had contacts at the ports, relationships with freight brokers. He knew how to move objects internationally with minimal clearance delays. She stopped. He was good at it. And someone used that. Someone used him, she said. He didn't know what he was moving. I know that because I know my father, and because the investigation found no financial benefit. He wasn't paid above his standard consulting rate for any of the transactions they flagged. If he'd known what the cargo was, he would have been paid more. That's how it works. Yes, Lucien said. It is. She looked at the document. Her father's signature, 22 years old, ordinary and damning in equal measure. The federal investigators had this, or a version of it. Then why wasn't it enough to charge him? Because charging him wasn't the goal, Lucien said, and something in his voice had changed, a weight that was specific and directed. He was looking at her steadily. The goal was to compromise him sufficiently that he couldn't testify against whoever was actually running the network. Destroy the credibility, eliminate the witness, let the investigation exhaust itself against a dead end. Vivian looked at him. You already knew, she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just the shape of what she was seeing. You already knew my father was used. I knew someone civilian had been used as the portside face of the operation in that period. I didn't know who until 2 nights ago when you told me. He held her gaze. I should have told you what I knew immediately. I didn't because I needed to confirm it first and because, he paused, because I wasn't certain how you'd respond. How did you think I'd respond? I thought you might leave, he said simply. She looked at her father's signature again. She folded the document carefully and put it in her jacket's inner pocket, against her chest. I'm not leaving, she said. She wasn't angry at him for withholding it. She wanted to be, because anger would have been cleaner and more manageable than what she actually felt, which was the specific grief of a person who has just had a 23-year suspicion confirmed in the worst possible location at the worst possible time and is going to have to set it aside and keep functioning. She had spent enough time in the presence of damaged things to know that you don't attempt full assessment in the field. You stabilize, you document, you move to a controlled environment. Then you assess. She stabilized. She documented. She moved. Soren had found the secondary documents Vivian needed: physical manifests, inventory lists, a shipping schedule for the incoming component of the collection, in a metal lockbox behind the collapsed shelving. He'd opened it with a tool from a kit he carried without drama or explanation, and the contents were spread across the top of a crate now, and Vivian was photographing everything while Lucian read and Soren watched the building's access points with the unhurried attention of someone who gets paid to notice things before they become problems. The incoming component was scheduled for 11 p.m. 4 vehicles, 2 drivers per vehicle, a coordination contact identified only by a call sign. The cargo was described in the shipping documents as residential relocation materials, which was the specific cover used for large volume art movement that needed to look domestic rather than commercial. And then Soren said quietly, "We have a problem." He was looking at his phone. Something in the set of his shoulders had changed, a compression, controlled but visible. He crossed the space to Lucien and showed him the phone's screen. Lucien looked at it. Something happened in his face that Vivian hadn't seen before and would not easily forget. Not panic, because she was beginning to understand that Lucien Moretti did not panic, but something below panic, something foundational, like the moment when a structure that has been under stress for a long time finally shows the fault line. "The rehearsal," he said. 40 minutes ago, Soren said. Marco arrived and Elena's father pulled him aside before it started. His security flagged. "Show me," Vivian said. Soren looked at Lucien. Lucien nodded. Soren turned the phone toward her. It was a photograph. Taken at close range, poor angle, clearly from a surveillance camera. The entrance of a venue she didn't recognize. In the photograph, Marco Moretti was being handed a document by a man she didn't recognize. Marco's face in the photograph was turned slightly away from the camera, but his posture was visible, and his posture was the posture of a person who has just been handed something they were not prepared to receive. "What's in the document?" she said. "We don't know yet," Soren said. "The contact who sent this got it from venue security. He can't get close enough to see the content. But it was handed to Marco by someone Elena's father's security flagged as connected to..." Lucien stopped. "To Vincent." Vivian looked at the photograph. She looked at Marco's posture, the specific shape of a person in the moment before they understand something fully, the moment that comes immediately before the understanding arrives and changes everything. "Your uncle is moving early," she said, "or he's already moved and we didn't see it." Lucien turned away from them both. He walked 3 steps toward the north wall and stood there with his back to the room for a moment. 5 seconds, 6. And she watched his hands at his sides, the way they closed partially and released and closed again, and understood that this was what it looked like when a man who carries everything alone finally feels the weight exceed the carrying capacity. He turned back. His face was steady. His eyes were not. "We need to go," he said. "Now." They moved. The drive back from the terminal was 15 minutes in normal traffic. Soren made it in 9. Nobody spoke. Vivian held the interior hand grip and watched the city go past and ran through what she knew. The ledger, the terminal, her father's signature, Vincent's timeline, and tried to find the thing she was missing, because there was something she was missing. She could feel the shape of it the way she could feel the shape of a gap in a painting's history, the specific contour of an absence. They were 3 blocks from the venue, a private event space in the Gold Coast that Lucien had mentioned during the briefing as Marco's choice for the rehearsal dinner. When Lucien's phone rang, he looked at it, his jaw set. "It's Marco," he said. He answered. He listened. He said 3 words, "I'm almost there," and ended the call. "He knows," Lucien said. "What does he know?" "I don't know yet. Enough to call me the way he just called me." He looked at Vivian. "When we get out of this car, you are with me. You are my date. You are an art consultant I've been seeing for several months. You know nothing about the terminal, nothing about the ledger, and nothing about anything that has happened since Wednesday night. And if Marco asks me directly?" "He won't." Lucien looked at her. "He'll ask me, and I'll handle it." She looked back at him. "The way you always handle it." Something flickered in his expression. "Yes." "Lucien." She said his name the way she'd said it that first morning, which was the way you say someone's name when you're asking them to stop doing the thing they're doing and be present instead. What Marco was handed, it's something that changes what he knows about you, about your family, something your uncle wanted him to have now, before the wedding, before Saturday. He didn't answer. "Because whatever it is," she said, "it's designed to put Marco in a position where he has to choose, between his brother and something else. She watched his face. What is Vincent using? A long pause. Soren pulled the car to the curb. Our father, Lucian said. She waited. Our father died 2 years ago. Heart failure, which was accurate as far as it went. He looked at his hands. What wasn't accurate was the account of the 18 months before he died. He had been diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition, cognitively significant. In the last year of his life, he was not fully competent to make the decisions he was still officially making. He paused. Decisions about organizational structure, about succession, about financial arrangements. I managed his affairs in that period. I made choices on his behalf. I recorded them as his choices because the alternative, declaring his incapacity, would have destabilized everything, created a vacuum that would have allowed exactly what's happening now to happen then, years earlier, before I was prepared to hold it. Vivian was very still. Vincent knows this, Lucian said. He's known it because he was there. And if he's given Marco a document showing that I operated outside my authority during that period, he stopped. Marco will have every reason to question every decision I made, including the ones that protected him. Especially those, his voice was even. The evenness cost him something. Marco has spent his whole life accepting that he doesn't know everything about this family because I told him there were things he didn't need to know. If he now has evidence that I used that trust to act without authorization, he won't just question the decisions, Vivian said. He'll question you. Yes. The door was waiting to be opened. Through the car window, Vivian could see the venue entrance, the gathered members of a wedding party and the specific heightened state of people who are managing something they don't fully understand. She could see, at the far edge of the entrance canopy, Marco Moretti standing with his arms crossed and his face turned toward the street, watching the car. He'd been watching for it. There's something else, she said. Not a question. Lucian looked at her. The chain of custody document. My father's signature. She said it carefully. You said you didn't know it was my father until 2 days ago. But you knew someone civilian was used as the portside face. You knew the period, 90s, early 2000s. You knew the network. She held his gaze. You had access to your uncle's operations records for 8 months. 8 months of building this file. She paused. Did you know it was my father before I told you? The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. I suspected, he said. I wasn't certain. But you had my photograph in a surveillance file before the museum. Yes. And you came to that alley not because you happened to be following the men who broke into the lab. Another pause. Shorter. No. You came because you knew I'd be there, because you'd been watching me. She kept her voice level. Because whoever was using the collection at that terminal had used my father to move it, and you calculated that I might eventually reach the same evidence he'd been silenced for having, and you wanted to be there when I did. The silence this time was different. It had the quality of something structural. Vivian, tell me I'm wrong. He looked at her. He didn't tell her she was wrong. She felt it move through her. Not rage, which would have been simpler. Something colder and more complex. The specific sensation of a foundation shifting while you're standing on it. She had come into this man's car 4 days ago because the alternative was worse. She had worked beside him and trusted his information, that his motives and her motives were aligned. And they were aligned. That was the thing that made it complicated rather than simple. So they were aligned, but not in the way she'd understood. He had needed her for what she knew, yes. But he had also engineered her involvement, had calculated that a woman motivated by her father's destroyed reputation would be a useful ally, and had positioned himself as her rescuer in an alley he'd known she'd run to because he'd helped create the conditions that sent her running. How much of Wednesday night did you arrange? She said. I didn't arrange the men in the lab, he said, and his voice had changed. It had the specific quality of a man saying a true thing that is also insufficient. I didn't put you in that building or in that alley. The painting, the ledger, the attack. That was Vincent. I only knew it was likely to happen. And you were there. Yes. Because you needed me. He held her gaze. Because I needed what you had and what you knew, and because I believed you deserved to know what your father's name was in. He paused. Both of those things are true at the same time. I understand if that's not enough. Through the window, Marco was still watching the car. It wasn't enough. She knew that. And she also knew that she was sitting in a car with a man who had just told her the truth when a lie would have been easier, and that the terminal was happening tonight, and that her father's documentation was in the ledger, and that none of the things she needed to do could be done without Lucien Moretti, and that this was not a situation where she had the luxury of enough. She reached past him and opened the car door. "After this is over," she said, "you and I are going to have a different conversation." "Yes," he said. "We are." She got out. The cold air hit her. Across the entrance canopy, Marco watched his brother emerge from the car after her, and whatever he read in Lucien's face made him unfold his arms and step forward. And Vivian watched the two brothers move toward each other and understood that the conversation they were about to have was going to determine whether everything held or broke apart, and that Lucien was walking into it alone because that was the only way he knew how to walk into anything. She stayed back. She was good at staying back when staying back was what was needed. What she was not good at, what she had never been good at in 12 years of careful professional distance, was standing outside the damage and not trying to fix it. The venue doors opened behind Marco, and from inside came the sound of people assembled for a celebration. And from just beside the door, moving out with the specific unhurried ease of a man who has already won whatever game is being played, came a tall man in his 60s with dark eyes and a face that was Lucien's face, made older and colder and stripped of whatever Lucien's face had that this one didn't. Vincent Brennan Moretti looked at his nephew. He looked at Vivian. He smiled with the portion of his face that performed smiling without involving the rest of it. "Lucien," he said, "you brought a guest." He looked at Vivian with an attention that was not a greeting. "Ms. Hale, I understand you've had quite a week." Lucien stepped forward, just one step. But it put him between Vivian and his uncle in a way that was so deliberate it was almost architectural, and Vincent's smile didn't move, and Marco was watching this with the expression of someone who has finally seen the shape of something they've been sensing for a very long time and finding it larger than they feared. "Uncle Vincent," Lucien said, in the quietest voice Vivian had ever heard from him, the voice below the voice he used for dangerous things. "This conversation is going to happen somewhere that isn't the entrance to my brother's rehearsal dinner." Vincent looked at him for a long moment. "Of course," he said. "We have so much to discuss." His eyes moved back to Vivian, and in them she saw something that was not anger and was not contempt, but was something far more specific and operational than either, the look of a man identifying a variable and calculating its cost. She had been identified. She had been calculated. And somewhere between the terminal and this entrance canopy, the timeline had changed because Vincent Brennan Moretti had not come here tonight to threaten his nephew. He had come here because he was already 3 moves ahead, and he wanted them to know it. She reached into her jacket and felt the edge of the custody document with her father's signature against her fingers, and stood very still in the October cold, and understood for the first time since Wednesday night that she was not in a situation she could stabilize and document and move to a controlled environment. The damage was already in motion, and she was standing inside it, and the only question left was what kind of person she was willing to become to stop it. The conversation that needed to happen did not happen at the venue entrance. It happened in a private room off the main corridor, a catering staging area that Vincent had clearly identified and selected in advance, because he moved toward it with the ease of a man who had already walked the space, already measured its distances, already decided it was the right room for what he intended. Lucien followed. Vivian followed Lucien, and Vincent's 2 men, standing at the entrance canopy in the clothes of guests and the posture of something else entirely, moved to flank the corridor behind them with a casualness so practiced it was almost invisible. Almost. Marco started to follow. Lucien turned and looked at him once, just once, and Marco stopped. Not because Lucien said anything, not because his expression was threatening or pleading. It was neither. It was the specific look that passes between siblings who have negotiated a lifetime of unspoken agreements, and what this one said was, "Not yet. Stay where I can account for you." Marco stayed. He didn't like it. His jaw was set with the particular tension of a man performing patience he doesn't feel, and his eyes followed his brother until the door closed. The staging area was narrow and fluorescent lit, with folding tables along one wall and stacked chair carts along the other, the functional ugliness of the infrastructure behind a beautiful event. Vincent stood in the center of the space with his hands folded in front of him, completely at ease, wearing the relaxation of a man who has arranged exactly this moment and is now collecting on it. Lucien stood across from him. Vivian stood 2 steps behind Lucien and to his left, which put her in sight of the door. "I'll be brief," Vincent said. "I've always believed efficiency was a virtue. Your father didn't agree. Aldo liked to talk around things until the thing itself got tired of waiting. But you're not your father, are you, Lucien?" It was not a question. "No," Lucien said, "I'm not." "No. You're more direct, more contained." Vincent looked at him with the specific appreciation of a craftsman examining work he didn't make but recognizes. "It's why I expected you to find me eventually. I'm genuinely a little surprised it took this long." "It took exactly as long as I needed," Lucien said, "to understand the full shape of it." Vincent's eyes moved to Vivian. "And you brought help. An art conservator." Something in his voice was almost warm. "Callum hid it inside a painting. I should have been more surprised by that when I found out. He had a certain sense of drama." He looked at her directly. "You broke the painting." "Yes," Vivian said. "A shame. It was a genuine work. Minor, but genuine." He tilted his head. "You've been very busy this week, Ms. Hale. I've been following your progress with considerable interest." He paused. "Your father would be proud. He was also persistent, in his way. Until he wasn't." The sentence landed where he'd aimed it and did what he'd intended. She felt it in her chest, a specific pressure that was not grief and was not rage, but was something that lived between them. She kept her face still. She would not give him the reaction. She had learned, in a week that had restructured several of her assumptions about herself, that not giving someone the reaction they've engineered is one of the few forms of power available in a room where you're otherwise outnumbered. "The document you gave Marco," Lucien said. "What's in it?" Vincent looked at him. "You know what's in it. I want to hear you say it. A summary of the decisions you made during your father's final 18 months. Financial restructuring, organizational reassignments, several contractual arrangements that modified the family's agreements with the Doyle syndicate in ways that favored your position at the expense of mine." He paused. "And a medical assessment, obtained legally, I should add, confirming Aldo's cognitive status during that period, confirming that he was not competent to authorize the decisions attributed to him. Those decisions kept this organization from collapse during the most vulnerable period it had faced in 30 years, Lucien said. "Yes," Vincent said agreeably. "They did. And they also consolidated control in your hands in a way that your father, had he been competent, might not have sanctioned." He tilted his head. "I'm not saying you acted wrongly, Lucien. I'm saying you acted unilaterally, and that Marco now has documentation of that unilateral action, and that Marco, who loves his brother, genuinely loves him, I've always found that touching, is currently standing in a corridor understanding that the person he trusted most has been making decisions for years that Marco didn't know about and couldn't sanction." He spread his hands. "Family is complicated." "What do you want?" Lucien said. "The ledger," Vincent said. "Or rather, the copy of it. Whatever the conservator managed to salvage from the original before she destroyed it." His eyes moved to Vivian. "The memory card, specifically." Vivian's hand did not move toward her jacket pocket. She was very careful about that. "The ledger is already in the hands of federal investigators," Lucien said. Vincent looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled. "No, it isn't. If it were, I would know, and you would not be standing in this room. You would be watching from a very safe distance while other people handled it." He looked at Lucien steadily. "You're here because you don't have enough yet. You have the ledger, and you have the terminal, and you have whatever you found there this morning. Yes, I know about this morning. But you don't have the one piece that makes all of it actionable. The coordination contact for tonight's transfer." He paused. "The person who bridges my operation to the incoming shipment. Without that identity, the transfer proceeds through cutouts that insulate me completely, and the ledger becomes a collection of numbers that point to dead ends and dissolved entities." He looked at Lucien with something that was almost respect. "You've built a very thorough case. It's missing the last wall." The room was quiet. The fluorescent light did what fluorescent light does, which is make every face look slightly more tired than it is. Every silence slightly more exposing. "You're offering to give it to me," Lucien said. "I'm offering an arrangement," Vincent said. The ledger and whatever evidence you've gathered is turned over to me. The terminal transfer proceeds without interference. In return, I provide you the coordination contact, genuine, verifiable, which, paradoxically, actually does allow you to shut down the incoming shipment. Just not my portion of it. The Doyle side takes the exposure. You maintain your position. The family continues. He paused. And Marco marries Elena tomorrow with a version of his brother still intact. Lucian stood very still. Vivian watched the back of his neck, which was the only part of him she could see clearly, and what she saw was stillness so complete it had moved past controlled into something else. The stillness of a person who has just had a trap revealed to them and is identifying exactly how the mechanism works before deciding whether to step in it or dismantle it. You'd give up the Doyle Alliance, Lucian said. The Doyle Alliance has served its purpose. Ronan Doyle is 67 years old, and his organization is 3 years from structural collapse, regardless of what happens tonight. The incoming shipment isn't a Doyle operation, they're the transport vehicle. The collection itself belongs to a network that doesn't need Doyle any more than I do. Vincent's expression was patient, the patience of a man explaining something that should be obvious. I built this over 20 years, Lucian. I don't need your family's name on it anymore. I haven't for some time. What I need is to complete the transfer tonight without a problem. Give me that, and you keep what you have. And Vivian, Lucian said. Vincent looked at her again. Ms. Hale goes home. Her father's documentation, which I assume she found at the terminal this morning, it was designed to be found by the right person under the right circumstances, is hers, a gesture of good faith. Vivian's throat tightened. She understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has studied how false provenance is constructed, what he'd just told her. Her father's documentation at the terminal had been placed there. It was not Callum Reese's record. It was Vincent's. Her father's signature on that chain of custody record was genuine, but the record itself had been constructed and positioned for exactly this use, not as evidence against her father, but as a pressure point for her. He'd expected her to find it. He'd expected it to make her want to deal. He was right that she'd found it. He was wrong about what it made her want. She looked at the side of Lucian's face. She could see the jawline, the faint movement as he worked through what he'd just been offered. The exact calibration of a man who has spent his life making decisions with incomplete information and knows how to do it, and hates that he knows how to do it. I need an hour, Lucian said. Of course, Vincent said warmly. The rehearsal dinner starts at 7. I'll see you both there. He buttoned his jacket. Ms. Hale. It was genuinely a pleasure. Your father raised someone with exceptional instincts. He left. His 2 men left with him. The door closed. The room was very quiet. Vivian said, He put that document in the terminal himself. My father's signature. Yes, Lucian said. He hadn't moved. It's a fabrication. Not the signature. The signature is real, pulled from a legitimate transaction. But the chain of custody record around it was constructed, placed there so I'd find it and feel the weight of it and be in exactly the emotional position I was in getting out of that car. Yes. He knew I'd be with you. He planned for me specifically. He plans for everything specifically. Lucian finally turned. His face looked the way faces look at the end of something long. Not defeated, which was too clean a word for it, but worn in the specific places that bear weight over time. He's been doing this longer than I've been doing anything. Vivian looked at him. You're not considering his offer? No. Good. She said it flatly. Because the offer is a trap with a specific mechanism. He gives you the coordination contact. You use it to interdict the Doyle side of the transfer, and what you've actually done is clean up his loose end for him. The Doyle connection is the liability he wants removed. You remove it for him, believing you've won something, and he completes his own transfer with a network. The ledger doesn't name because they came online after Callum Reese stopped recording. Lucian looked at her. Something moved in his expression. The specific register of a person who has thought the same thing and is now verifying it against another mind that reached the same conclusion independently. How long did it take you to work that out? About 30 seconds after he stopped talking. She looked at the door. The missing wall isn't the coordination contact. The missing wall is the post-Reese network. The people and accounts he's built since 2017 when the ledger entries stop. That's what tonight's transfer funds. That's what becomes self-sustaining after the transaction clears. She looked back at Lucian. If we let the transfer happen, even if we take the Doyle side down, he's capitalized and independent, and he never needs to touch your family's infrastructure again. He's gone, and he's funded, and he's clean. Then we stop the transfer, Lucian said. We stop the transfer, she said, but we need the post-Reese network first, tonight, before the shipment arrives. She looked at him. Who has access to his current financial architecture? Not his Moretti-affiliated accounts, his private structure. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Then he said one name. Carmine. Carmine, whose firm registered the shell company that holds the terminal property. Yes, which means Carmine is either Vincent's man entirely, or Vincent used Carmine's firm without Carmine's knowledge through the junior partner. I've been trying to determine which for 3 days, Lucien said. I don't know. We need to know, tonight. He pulled out his phone. He looked at it. He put it back. If I call Carmine and he's Vincent's, I show my hand completely. If you don't call Carmine and he's not Vincent's, you lose the one person who has access to the financial records that give you the network. She met his gaze. You have to choose which mistake you can afford. He chose. He called. Carmine answered on the second ring. Lucien said, I need to see you. Not at the office. Not at the venue. He gave an address, a private location Vivian didn't know, and said 40 minutes and ended the call. He looked at her. If he's Vincent's man, we'll know within the first 60 seconds of the meeting. How? Because he'll come with company, Lucien said. They left through the staging area's secondary exit, a service door that put them in the alley alongside the venue rather than the main entrance. And Soren was already there, because Soren was always already there, which Vivian was beginning to understand was not coincidence, but the result of a man who had mapped every building Lucien Moretti was likely to be in before Lucien was in it. The drive was 18 minutes. Nobody spoke. Chicago moved outside the windows in the specific way it moves on a Friday evening in October, the city running toward the weekend with the concentrated energy of somewhere that works hard and intends to stop working hard at a specific time and not before. It felt surreal to be moving through it, all those people with their ordinary destinations carrying the weight of what was in that staging room. Carmine came alone. He was already at the address when they arrived, a parking structure in the West Loop, 3rd level, which offered sightlines in 4 directions and no convenient points of concealment. He stood next to his car with his hands in his coat pockets and his face showing the specific quality of a man who has been expecting a call like this and is not relieved that it finally came. Lucien got out. Vivian got out. Soren stayed in the car with the engine running. Carmine looked at Vivian. He looked at Lucien. He said, The junior partner at my firm who registered that shell company, his name is Dell. He interned under Vincent 6 years ago, and I have been watching him for 7 months, and I have not been able to prove anything. He pulled his hands from his pockets. I came alone because whatever you think of me right now, I would like the opportunity to explain before you decide. Lucien looked at him for 10 seconds. Talk. Carmine talked. It took 11 minutes and covered ground that was painful in the particular way that professional betrayal is painful. The gradual discovery, the self-questioning, the months of trying to determine whether what you're seeing is real before you act on it, the specific paralysis of someone who has built a life inside a system and is now watching the system reveal a rot they should have seen sooner. He'd found the shell company connection 3 months ago. He'd been building documentation since. He had, he told Lucien, been intending to bring it forward after the wedding, after Marco was safely out of the immediate radius. The post-Reese network, Vivian said, Vincent's private financial structure, the accounts that the ledger doesn't name. Does Dell have access to those? Carmine looked at her. Yes. Through document preparation he did for Vincent directly. He paused. I have copies of the preparation files. I've had them for 6 weeks. Vivian looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at Carmine. Why didn't you come to me 6 weeks ago? Carmine was quiet for a moment. Because 6 weeks ago I wasn't certain whose side you were on. The sentence sat in the cold air. Lucien absorbed it without expression, which was itself a kind of expression. The face of a man recognizing that the isolation he'd maintained had costs he'd been paying without noticing the invoices. I need everything Dell prepared, Lucien said. Tonight, before 11. I can have it to you by 8, Carmine said. Do it. They went back to the car. Vivian got in. The door closed and the warmth of the vehicle hit her, and she became aware for the first time in several hours of the physical reality of her body. The tightness across her shoulders, the dull ache in her feet from the terminal's concrete floors, the particular exhaustion that comes from a sustained adrenaline economy where the body has been running hot for too long and is starting to send small memos about it. She ignored the memos. There was still too much to do. At 6:45, they were back at the apartment, Carmine's files arriving digitally in encrypted packets that Lucian opened, and Vivian began mapping against the ledger data. The post-Reese network was exactly what she'd expected, a second architecture, cleaner and more contemporary than what Callum had recorded, built in the years since 2017 with the sophistication of someone who had learned from every vulnerability in the previous structure. Shell companies in 4 jurisdictions. Correspondent accounts routed through financial institutions with minimal disclosure requirements. A central holding entity registered in a jurisdiction that Vivian recognized from her provenance research as the specific choice of operators who needed maximum legal insulation. And at the center of the holding entity, a trustee designation. A name. Not Vincent's name. A name she didn't recognize. She showed it to Lucian. He looked at it. Something happened in his face. Ronan Doyle, he said. She stared at the screen. Doyle is the trustee of Vincent's private holding structure, which means the separation between Vincent and the Doyle syndicate is not what Vincent presented it as, Lucian said slowly, working through it as he spoke. He told us the Doyle alliance was disposable, that the incoming shipment was his transfer, using Doyle as a transport vehicle. He looked at the screen. But Doyle is the legal trustee of the entity that holds everything Vincent has built. They're not separate organizations with a transactional relationship, Vivian said. They're a single operation. Vincent runs the Moretti-adjacent infrastructure. Doyle provides the legal shelter for the actual assets. She pulled up the terminal manifests on the secondary tablet. The incoming shipment tonight isn't just new capital. It's the final transfer of the artwork assets into an entity that Doyle controls legally, which means Vincent controls practically, which means the moment that transfer clears, the entire collection is in a structure that the Moretti family has zero claim on and zero access to. She looked up. He wasn't building independence from your family. He was building a vault. And tonight he locks it. Lucian stood up. He moved to the window. He stood there with his hands at his sides and looked at the city. And the October dark was coming down outside, and the lights were beginning to do what Chicago lights do in the evening, which is assert against the dark with a kind of aggressive insistence. And Vivian watched the reflection of his face in the glass and read what was there. Marco, he said quietly. What? Marco's rehearsal dinner. He looked at his watch. Starts in 12 minutes. I'm supposed to be there. He turned from the window. I'm supposed to stand beside my brother tonight and be the person he thinks I am for one more evening before I have to show him what I've actually been doing for 15 years. Vivian was quiet. If I miss the dinner, Vincent uses the absence. Tells Marco whatever he needs to tell him, finishes whatever the document didn't complete. He looked at her. If I go to the dinner, I'm not at the terminal at 11. I'll be at the terminal at 11, Vivian said. Absolutely not. Lucian, I said no. His voice had an edge she hadn't heard since the first night. The edge that comes from someone who has run out of the energy required to be reasonable about the things that matter most. You are not going into that terminal alone. The men who come with that shipment will not be. I know what they'll be, she said. I also know the manifest notations, the crate configurations, which works are which and where they came from, and what the documentation trail looks like. And I know which specific pieces in that collection are verifiably the property of families who have spent 80 years trying to recover them. That knowledge matters tonight. It matters for what we do with the evidence. She stood up. Soren goes with me. You go to the dinner. You stand beside Marco for 2 hours. And at 10:45 you leave the dinner and you come to the terminal. He looked at her. He was calculating, and she could see him calculating, and she could also see the place where the calculation stopped being about logistics and started being about something else. The thing underneath the logistics that he had not said, and would probably not say because he was not a person who said that kind of thing easily. Take the other phone, he said, the one Soren gave you in addition to mine. Keep it in your left pocket. Why the left pocket specifically? Because your right hand is dominant, and if something happens, your left hand is free to. He stopped. He looked at her. He said, "Just take it." She took it. At 7:15, Lucien left for the rehearsal dinner. He left in the second car with two men Vivian had not previously seen, which told her there was a layer of his security infrastructure she hadn't been shown, and she filed this without comment because she was beginning to understand that with Lucien Moretti, you didn't see everything at once. You saw what was relevant to the current radius of risk, and that was probably healthy. She and Soren ate. She hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning, and her body had begun lodging formal complaints. And she reviewed the terminal maps and the crate coordinates and the manifest data until she knew it, the way she knew condition reports she'd written herself. Not from memory, but in the deeper way where the information has become structural. At 9:30, they left for the terminal. The night had come down fully, and the cold was real now, the kind that settles in and means business. Soren drove without headlights for the last 3 blocks, navigating by the terminal's ambient light. The facility was more illuminated than it had been that morning, which told her the loading bay doors had been opened and the interior systems activated. Someone had been there between their morning visit and now. They went through the fence gap at the eastern perimeter. The fence section had been moved, not repaired, but repositioned, the gap slightly narrowed. Someone had noted it and adjusted without closing it entirely, which meant someone knew it was there and was using it as a secondary access point. Vivian filed this and kept moving. The interior of the terminal was transformed. The ambient light she'd seen from outside was from portable work lights positioned along the loading bay wall, 4 of them, industrial grade, the kind brought in for a specific task and taken away after. The crates along the north wall were in the process of being repositioned. 3 had already been moved toward the loading bay doors, and 2 men in dark clothing were working a 4th with a manual pallet jack, moving with the efficient rhythm of people performing a familiar task on a deadline. 2 additional men stood at the south end of the building, not working, watching. Soren put his hand on her arm. They were behind the collapsed shelving unit at the building's east side, in the shadow between 2 work lights. The shelter was adequate for now. It would not be adequate when the incoming vehicles arrived and the lighting expanded. Vivian counted. 4 men visible, possibly more in sections she couldn't see. The loading bays were open and the cold was moving through the building in long currents, carrying the smell of salt and diesel and, underneath that, the specific smell she'd noticed that morning. The solvents, stronger now. She looked at the crates being moved. She could see the manifest tags from where she was crouched. She could read 2 of them. Both matched coordinates from the ledger's cargo columns, works that Callum Reese had documented moving through the network in 2004 and 2005. Her phone vibrated. She looked at it. Lucy. A text, not a call. Dinner is. Marco knows more than I thought. Hold the terminal. I am leaving now. She typed back. Already inside, 4 visible. Incoming still on schedule. He responded in 11 seconds. Do not engage. Wait. She put the phone in her left pocket. The incoming vehicles arrived at 10:52, 8 minutes early, which was either precision or a deliberate timing adjustment designed to catch any interference at the scheduled hour. 4 vehicles, a large panel truck and 3 SUVs, entered through the southern access gate, which had been opened from the inside, which meant the men already in the terminal had been given gate access as part of the operations infrastructure, which meant the 2 operations, the existing collection and the incoming shipment, were not the separate components the shipping documentation suggested. They were one movement, one coordinated transfer, timed and synchronized, with the existing crates as collateral and the incoming cargo as the activating capital. The panel truck backed toward the second loading bay. The 3 SUVs positioned in a triangle around the south entrance, their headlights washing the interior in harsh light that moved the shadows dramatically and eliminated the shelter of Vivian and Soren's position within approximately 30 seconds. Soren moved first. He had her arm again, moving her back and left along the eastern wall in the new light geometry, finding the angle of cover behind a concrete support column that hadn't been part of their morning mapping because they hadn't needed it then. He moved without hesitation and without sound, and she matched his pace as closely as she could, and the 2 men at the south end of the building had their attention on the incoming vehicles and did not look east. From the panel truck came 3 men, and then, after them, a 4th who was not dressed like the others, Not work clothing, but a dark wool overcoat, city clothes, the clothes of someone who comes to oversee rather than to labor. He stood beside the truck and looked at the interior of the facility with the expression of someone conducting a final inspection of something they've built over a very long time. Even at this distance, in this light, she recognized the posture. Vincent Brennan Moretti had come to watch his vault close. He stood with his hands behind his back and watched his men begin the transfer with the patience of a man who is accustomed to the gap between planning and completion and has learned to occupy that gap without impatience. He spoke briefly to one of the incoming men, something short and directive. He walked slowly along the row of crates, glancing at tags, making a count. A man who knows what he has and wants to confirm it is all there. Vivian's phone vibrated. She looked at it. 10 minutes out. Do not let the transfer complete. Anything you can do. She looked at Soren. I was already looking at her, which meant he'd heard the vibration and registered its implications. He raised his eyebrows in a minimal, precise expression that meant, your call. She looked at the loading bay. The panel truck's rear doors were open, and the first incoming crates were being moved out on wheeled dollies, 2 men per crate, working efficiently in the cold. The work lights from inside and the SUV headlights from outside created a collision of angles that turned the space into a patchwork of brightness and deep shadow. She looked at the work lights. 4 of them, on stands, connected to a portable generator she'd noticed along the east wall during the morning visit, and confirmed was still there when they came in tonight. The generator powered the lights. The lights, positioned along the loading bay wall, were the primary illumination for the crates being moved. Without them, the loading bay went to near darkness, broken only by the SUV headlights, which pointed inward and would be partially blocked by the panel truck. She looked at Soren. She pointed at the generator. She held up 8 fingers. 8 seconds to reach it from their current position, moving fast along the east wall while the incoming crew's attention was on the transfer. Soren looked at the generator. He looked at her. He shook his head once, meaning, I go, not you. She shook her head back, meaning, both or neither. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an estimate. Then he nodded. They moved at the same time the panel truck engine cut, which was the moment when ambient sound decreased and footsteps became more audible and the risk doubled. She moved along the east wall with her body low and her eyes on the men at the loading bay and her feet finding the floor's surface without looking at it. The same spatial memory that had carried her down the museum's service corridor in the dark. The same spatial knowledge that 12 years of moving carefully through rooms full of fragile things had built into her body without her consciously registering it. Soren hit the generator first. He looked at her. She was 4 feet behind him. She nodded. He pulled the main disconnect. The work lights died. All 4 simultaneously, dropping the loading bay into a darkness broken only by the collision of the SUV headlights around the bulk of the panel truck, creating pools of light and large zones of shadow that hadn't existed before. From the loading bay came voices, sharp and confused. Movement. The men with the dollies stopped because they couldn't see what they were moving. The 2 watchers at the south end moved toward the bay reflexively. Vincent's voice from somewhere in the new darkness. Lights. Find the generator. And from the south access gate, a sound she recognized. The specific compression of multiple vehicles arriving fast, the sound different from the incoming convoy, and then the lights, which were different too. Multiple sources, mobile, the kind mounted on vehicles that are not trying to be discreet because discretion is no longer the point. Lucienne had not come alone. She pressed her back against the east wall and stayed absolutely still and let the chaos organize itself around her without moving through it, because moving through a chaos you haven't mapped is how you become a casualty of it. She could hear voices, commands, responses, the particular verbal structure of people executing a plan, and she could hear the sound of the operation changing from a transfer to something else, the shift in energy when a situation moves from controlled to contested. Soren was beside her. His hand found her shoulder in the dark. Stay here, he said, in the quietest voice she'd heard from him. She stayed. What she could see from the east wall in the mobile lights coming through the loading bay doors was a series of silhouettes moving with different purposes, some moving toward the doors, some moving away from them, some standing in the particular stillness of people who have decided in real time that the situation has changed and are waiting to understand the new terms. The men from the incoming convoy were the ones moving toward the doors, which was instinct, move toward the exit, and they were meeting something at the exit that redirected them, which she could hear but not see clearly. She could see Vincent. He was moving neither toward the doors nor away from them. He was moving toward the crates, the existing collection, the north wall. He was moving toward something specific. She tracked him through the chaos of light and shadow, and she understood what he was doing a moment before he did it. If the transfer was blown, the collection was evidence. And the person who controls evidence controls the narrative. He had a phone out. She understood. He was calling someone to move the collection. A secondary extraction plan, already prepared. She moved. She crossed the space between the east wall and the north wall, while Vincent's attention was on his phone, and while the activity at the loading bay doors provided the noise cover and the mobile lights provided the directional distraction. She moved the way she moved through the museum's service corridor. Fast, low, feet certain, eyes forward, and she reached the north wall and the crates and the row of manifest tags, and she did the one thing she'd been trained for 12 years to do with objects that needed to be protected from people who had no right to them. She documented. She photographed every manifest tag in the north wall row, rapid and systematic, starting at the left end and moving right, 32 crates in 45 seconds. The phone's camera working in near darkness with the flash suppressed because flash would be visible. She photographed the physical chain of custody documents still clipped to 6 of the crates. She photographed the lockbox contents that Soren had left on a crate top that morning, which were still there because nobody had moved them. And then Vincent's hand was on her arm, and his grip was not gentle. "Ms. Hale." His voice was very close. He had not called for help, which meant he was still calculating. Even now, even in this, he was calculating. And what he'd calculated was that she was more useful to him as leverage than as an obstacle. "Come with me. Now." She did not go with him. She planted her feet the way her father had once taught her, in a memory so old she'd forgotten it until her body produced it, and she kept photographing with her right hand while her left hand braced against the crate behind her, and she did not go. His grip tightened. She felt it through her jacket, through the muscle, a pressure that was moving toward pain. "The photographs," he said, "are irrelevant. Whatever you've taken, I have people who can—" "Vivian," Lucian's voice, from somewhere behind Vincent, closer than she'd expected. Vincent turned. Lucian Moretti stood 6 feet away in the mobile light coming through the loading bay doors, and behind him were 2 men, and behind them was the particular geometry of a situation that has tipped, the kind of tipping that doesn't tip back. He looked at his uncle with the expression she'd seen forming across the week, the expression that had been in construction behind all the containment and the calculation and the exhaustion, which was the expression of a man who has been managing his grief and his anger and his love for a family that one of its own members had been systematically gutting, and who has finally run out of reasons to manage it quietly. "Let her go," Lucian said. Vincent looked at his nephew. He looked at the crates. He looked at the loading bay doors. He made a very fast assessment, the assessment of a man who has built everything on knowing when to advance and when to regroup. And what he saw was the math of a situation where the math had changed. His grip on Vivian's arm released. She stepped sideways, out of his reach, and kept her phone in her hand and kept breathing, and looked at Lucian, who was looking at his uncle, and the space between them was small, and the silence was the kind that comes before something that can't be unsaid. 20 years, Lucian said. His voice was quiet. It was more frightening for being quiet. "You built this inside my family for 20 years. Vincent looked at him. For the first time since the staging area, something in his face had moved past calculation into the territory of what a person actually is when the architecture is down. He looked at Lucian the way a person looks at someone they chose a long time ago not to account for. "Your family," Vincent said, with a bitterness that was the first genuinely unguarded thing he'd produced all evening, "was never mine. I built that family. I held it together through 3 transitions and 2 federal investigations, and a period when your father was incapable of holding his own coffee cup, and I was the manager, always the manager." He looked at Lucian with something that was almost grief. "Never the inheritor." Lucian said nothing. He looked at his uncle and said nothing, and the nothing was not empty but full. Full of the weight of a family, and the cost of carrying it, and the price that had been paid by every person in this building over 20 years for a resentment that had been building in a man they trusted. From outside, additional vehicles. From the loading bay doors, voices that Vivian recognized as organized and official. The specific cadence of federal authority, which Carmine had apparently also called, or which Lucien had called before he arrived, or both. Evidence teams. The chain of custody was about to become very literal. She looked at the crates. 47 works representing 80 years of missing history, sitting in a condemned terminal in Chicago, about to be documented and cataloged and returned to the long process of restitution. She thought about the families who'd been looking for some of these works for 3 generations. She thought about provenance chains, about the gap years, about the specific shape of an absence in a record. She looked at her phone and the photographs she'd taken and thought, this is a complete record. This is what survives. Vincent Brennan Moretti turned toward the loading bay doors when the federal vehicles came through them. He turned back to Lucien one last time, and what was in his face in that last moment was not defiance and was not remorse, but was something in between. The expression of a man looking at the conclusion of something he'd known for a long time was going to end this way, and had built so much that he'd almost convinced himself it wouldn't. The shipping contact, Vivian said. She looked directly at Vincent. The real one. Not the one you offered Lucien as a trap, the actual coordination contact for the post-Reese network. She held his gaze. You're going to tell someone that name tonight. You can choose who. Vincent looked at her. He looked at Lucien. He looked at the loading bay doors where the federal agents were moving through with the efficient purposefulness of an operation that has been prepared and is now executing. He looked at the crates, his life's work in criminal architecture, sitting in tagged plywood under fluorescent light, about to become the property of federal evidence rooms and eventually, if the restitution process worked as it was supposed to, the property of the people they'd been stolen from. He said a name. Vivian photographed the name in a text note on her phone before he could change his mind, and sent it to both numbers in her recent contacts list, and watched the federal agents cross the space between the loading bay and the north wall, and stood in the cold terminal air and breathed fully for what felt like the first time in 5 days. Lucien was beside her. She hadn't heard him move. I was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which in the terminal cold was not nothing. The photographs, he said, the ones you just took. Complete manifest record. Every tag, every chain of custody document. She looked at him. Everything in this building is documented. Whatever happens with the legal process, there's a record that can't be disputed. He looked at the crates. He looked at his uncle being walked toward the loading bay by 2 federal agents, Vincent moving with the particular controlled dignity of a man who has decided that whatever composure he has left, he will not surrender. He looked at the loading bay and at the city visible beyond it through the open doors, Chicago asserting itself in the dark. He said quietly, Marco. Is he? He's at the venue. He's angry and he's frightened and he doesn't entirely understand what's happened, but he's there. He paused. He stayed. Vivian thought about the look Marco had given her in the corridor outside the staging area, the look of a man who has been sensing the shape of something for a long time and has just seen it. She thought about what it costs to have a brother who carries things alone and what it costs the brother to be protected, and she thought that sometimes the distance between people who love each other is not a failure of love, but an accumulation of protected distances that have never been navigated because the navigation itself seemed too dangerous. She thought about her father in his apartment in Evanston, 12 miles north, sleeping or not sleeping. Call him, she said. Call Marco now. Lucien looked at her. He stayed, she said. That's the answer to the question you've been afraid to ask. Call him. He took out his phone. He stood in the loading bay doorway with the federal agents moving around him and the city behind him, and the remains of his uncle's 20-year construction being systematically documented around him, and he called his brother. Vivian walked to the north wall and stood next to the crate that held the chain of custody document with her father's name on it. The real one, not Vincent's fabrication. The legitimate purchasing record from 1994 that had been pulled from somewhere in Vincent's files and placed in the terminal as a pressure point. She looked at it. It was her father's handwriting. An ordinary transaction, 22 years ago, by a man who was good at his job and trusted the people who hired him and had no mechanism for knowing what he was moving. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she photographed it, carefully, the way she photographed everything she intended to preserve, and put her phone in her pocket and listened to the sound of Lucien's voice in the loading bay doorway. low and unguarded for the first time she'd heard it, saying his brother's name. The federal agents worked through the night. Vivian watched them from the loading bay doorway for a long time, long enough that the cold stopped feeling like an imposition and started feeling like a condition, the baseline reality of the night, something she'd simply adjusted to without deciding to. She watched them move through the crates with the specific methodical quality of people who know that the quality of their documentation tonight will determine the quality of every legal proceeding that follows. And she found something in that quality that was familiar to her. The care that comes from understanding that objects carry history that can be lost if the hands holding them are careless. She'd spent her whole career asking that kind of care from people and not always getting it. These people had it. Lucian's call with Marco lasted 19 minutes. She knew because she'd looked at her phone when he started and looked at it again when he stopped. Not to track him, but because her own hands needed something to hold. When he came back from the doorway, he looked like a person who had set down a weight they'd been carrying for so long they'd stopped noticing it was there, and then set it down, and now felt the absence of it in every muscle that had been adjusted around it. "He's coming here," Lucian said. "To the terminal?" "In the morning, when it's light." He looked at the loading bay, at the federal agents, at the crates being processed. "He wants to see it." Vivian thought about what it would mean for Marco to walk through this building in the morning light and understand the scale of what had been built inside his family without his knowledge. She thought it would be hard and necessary, and that Marco would be better for it than he'd been before it, and that none of those things would make it easier when it happened. "Good," she said. Lucian looked at her. He had the look of someone who has been up for a very long time and has passed through the stage of exhaustion that feels dramatic into the quieter stage on the other side of it, where the body is just doing what it does, and the person inside it has made peace with that. "Carmine is coordinating the evidence custody," he said. "There will be questions, testimony, a federal process that is going to take a very long time." "I know. Your name is in it, not as a subject. They know what happened at the museum. Carmine has already provided the security footage from the building's external cameras that shows the men entering. It corroborates your account entirely. But as a witness," he looked at her carefully, "it will not be simple." "I was never expecting simple," Vivian said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Your father's name." She looked at him. "The legitimate chain of custody record. The real one. The one from 1994 that Vincent sourced to use against you. It's the cleanest documentation we have of the civilian-facing operation during that period. Combined with the ledger entries and the financial records Carmine has, it's possible to construct a complete picture of how your father's credentials were used and by whom." He held her gaze. "The federal investigators will have access to all of it. I've already spoken to their lead agent. Your father's status in the original investigation, the 2003 case, can be formally reviewed." Vivian absorbed this. The word reviewed was a careful word, a legal word, the word you use when you mean something that will take time and process and paperwork and cannot be promised in the specific way a person needs to hear it promised. She understood that. She'd spent enough time in institutional environments to know the difference between what is true and what can be delivered by a specific date. "Reviewed," she said. "It's the right word for what's possible right now," he said. "And what's possible right now is more than what was possible a week ago." She looked at the crates. She thought about her father. She thought about the specific weight of 23 years. Not the dramatic weight, not the weight of rage or grief, but the everyday weight of a person who has organized their life around an injury that never healed and never got acknowledged and never stopped mattering. The weight of getting up every morning and continuing to function around a thing that should have been addressed and wasn't. "I need to call him," she said. "There's a van on the south side with communications equipment. Private line, encrypted." Lucian looked at her. "Take as long as you need." She went to the van. She sat in the back seat with the door half open and the cold coming in and called her father's cell phone, which she'd had memorized since she was 11 years old and which rang 4 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep, but sharpening fast the way the voices of people who have spent years alert to bad news sharpen when the phone rings in the night. "Vivian, what, Dad?" She stopped. She'd had a plan for what she'd say, working through it in her head on the walk to the van, a sequence of information in the order that would make the most sense to him. The plan dissolved when she heard his voice. "I need you to listen to me. I'm okay." I'm safe. But I need to tell you some things, and I need you to stay on the line while I do." He stayed on the line. She talked for 22 minutes. She told him everything, in the order it had happened, without softening the parts that were frightening because he deserved the real version after 23 years of not having access to any version at all. She told him about the painting and the ledger and the terminal and Vincent Brennan Moretti and the chain of custody record with his name on it, and what it meant legally, and what it didn't mean yet, and what the federal review process could eventually produce. She told him the name, Callum Reese, of the accountant who had kept the records that documented exactly how the network had used civilian logistics consultants as unwitting transport faces. She told him that his name was in a federal evidence file tonight as a person whose reputation had been damaged by a criminal operation he'd had no knowledge of, and that this was different from being the subject of an investigation, and that the difference mattered. He was quiet for a long time after she stopped. Not the quiet of someone who hasn't heard, but the quiet of someone who is holding something very large very carefully because they don't yet know what to do with it. "The painting," he said finally. "The one in the museum. I destroyed it, the panel." Another pause. "Was it worth it?" "It was the only choice I had," she said. "I think that's the same as worth it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, but was the specific sound of a person who has been carrying something for so long that the prospect of setting it down has become more frightening than the carrying, because at least the carrying is familiar. "Come home," he said. "When you can, come home and bring that cat." "I'll be there in a few days," she said. "I promise." She hung up and sat in the van for a moment with the phone in her lap and the night around her and the sound of the federal operation continuing inside the terminal. She thought about the painting. She thought about it lying in pieces on the conservation lab floor, the panel cracked, the image destroyed, the hidden text exposed and photographed and now irrelevant because it had been found and documented and could not be unfound. She had broken an irreplaceable thing to protect what was inside it, and she had been right to do it, and it still cost something to have done it. That was the part people didn't talk about when they talked about necessary decisions. That necessary didn't mean free. You paid the price and you made peace with having paid it, and you moved on carrying the specific knowledge of what it had cost. She moved on. The terminal processed through the night and into the earliest hours of Saturday morning. Vivian worked alongside the federal documentation team for 3 hours, not as an investigator, but as a consultant. She knew the objects, knew the notation systems, knew the provenance gaps and what they signified, and the lead agent, a woman named Torres, who moved through the building with a focused intelligence that Vivian respected immediately, accepted her input without friction, and with the specific appreciation of someone who has just had their work made significantly easier by the arrival of the right expertise at the right moment. 47 crates, 39 distinct works identified from the original collection in the terminal. 11 of them matched active restitution claims in the art loss register, families and estates that had been seeking them for decades. The remaining 28 required further provenance research that would take months. But the documentation Vivian had photographed and the ledger entries gave every one of them a starting point that hadn't existed before tonight. The incoming shipment from the panel truck yielded 8 additional works, 4 of which were immediately identifiable from Torres's own investigative files as pieces that had moved through a specific dealer network the Federal Art Crime Division had been tracking for 6 years without being able to close. Tonight, they closed it. Vivian documented her documentation, her photographs, her notation, her provenance assessments, in a formal statement that Torres recorded and that would become part of the federal case record. She signed it at 4:27 in the morning on a folding table in the terminal's east section under fluorescent work lights, with her coat still on and her hands still cold, and felt the specific finality of a signature that means something beyond itself. Vincent Brennan Moretti was in federal custody by 2 a.m. The coordination contact he'd named, the trustee name, the bridge between his operation and the post-Reese network, turned out to be a financial attorney in Luxembourg whose name was already in 2 European regulatory investigations, and whose identification by Vincent tonight effectively collapsed the insulation structure that had been protecting both of them for 9 years. The attorney's legal team would spend considerable effort in the coming months arguing that Vincent's disclosure had been coerced, and they would spend that effort unsuccessfully because the disclosure had been witnessed by 3 federal agents and a conservator who had documented it on a phone that was already in the evidence chain. Ronan Doyle's connection to the holding entity, his trusteeship of Vincent's private structure, became the mechanism by which the federal investigation was able to bridge from the Chicago operation to the South Boston syndicate. That bridge, and what it produced, was not something Vivian followed closely in the months that came after. She knew it was there. She knew it mattered. She left it to the people whose job it was to follow it. She had her own work to do. Marco arrived at the terminal at 8:15 Saturday morning, as the first real daylight was coming through the loading bay doors. He came alone, which Vivian had not expected, and he walked through the building slowly, reading the manifest tags on the remaining crates. The documentation process was still ongoing, the federal team would be there for another day, and looking at the space with the expression of a person walking through a place that represents something they've been trying to understand for a long time. Lucian met him at the north wall. Vivian stayed back, in the east section near the support column that had sheltered her and Soren the night before. She stayed back because what happened between Marco and Lucien Moretti in that building on that morning was not something she had a right to be present for. And because she understood, better than she had the week before, having watched Lucian carry the specific weight of protecting someone who didn't know they were being protected, that some conversations need the space that comes when everyone who isn't necessary steps out of it. She watched them from 30 feet away, without hearing what they said. She watched Marco stand still for a long time while Lucian talked, watched him turn away once, and then turn back, watched his hands move to his face, in the gesture that people use when they're trying to contain something their face wants to do that they haven't decided to do yet. She watched Lucien stand very straight through all of it, which she had come to understand as the posture he held when he was most uncertain, the body's compensatory certainty against the mind's doubt. She watched Marco reach out and put his hand on the back of Lucian's neck, the way older brothers do, or the way brothers do who have traded the role of older back and forth for long enough that the distinction has become nominal. She watched Lucien close his eyes for 1 second. She looked away. She looked at the loading bay doors and the October morning coming through them, gray and clean, and she thought, they'll be all right. Not immediately and not easily, and the work of it would take longer than a morning. But the direction of it was clear. They'd be all right. The wedding happened. It happened at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon in a venue in the Gold Coast that smelled of white garden roses and had arrangements at the main entrance significantly taller than everyone else in the room because Elena's mother's preferences had been honored exactly as Marco had specified to his brother. Vivian wore a dress she'd bought Friday morning when Soren had driven her to the only upscale clothing store she knew that opened before 9 a.m. It was navy, fitted, and cost more than her monthly car payment. And she'd bought it without consulting anyone because she was through with being consulted about what she was capable of managing on her own. She sat beside Lucien during the ceremony. She had no official role, no title that would have explained to any external observer what she was doing in that seat, and she didn't try to manufacture one. She was there because she'd survived a week that had required her to be more than she'd known she was, and because the man beside her had asked her, without asking her, by simply not asking her not to come. The asking and the not asking were the same gesture when you'd spent enough time around someone to read the whole language of them. Marco and Elena were married at 4:17 in the afternoon, before a room of people that Vivian had been briefed on extensively and would spend the evening navigating with the careful situational awareness of someone who knows which people in a room are managing the knowledge that the world they were operating in has just fundamentally changed, and which people don't know yet, and which people are pretending not to know because pretending is what they're good at. She was good at reading rooms. It was not a skill she'd cultivated consciously. It came from years of walking into spaces containing fragile things and assessing immediately where the risk was. She'd just never applied it to people before this week. She applied it tonight. The reception was held in the same venue's ballroom, and it had the specific quality of a celebration that is both genuinely joyful and quietly electric with things that are not being said. Marco and Elena moved through their wedding reception with the luminous certainty of two people who have chosen each other and feel the rightness of that choice. And whatever Marco was carrying from the morning in the terminal, he carried it in the way Lucien had taught him, which was below the surface, where it could be held without being visible. Elena noticed something in him. She was not a woman who missed things, but she read it correctly as weight rather than regret, and she stayed close to him in the specific way that people who love each other stay close when they understand that proximity is itself a form of support. Vivian watched this and thought about what it meant to have someone who stayed close when the weight was visible, and to be someone who could be stayed close to, which required a willingness to let the weight be seen that she had not, in 41 years, fully developed. Lucien found her at the edge of the room at 8:30, where she'd retreated with a glass of wine she'd barely touched to a vantage point that gave her sightlines to most of the space. He stood beside her. He was in a dark suit, and he looked like what he was. A man who had gotten through the hardest week of his adult life and come out the other side of it changed in ways he hadn't finished mapping yet. "Marco told Elena," he said. Vivian looked at him. "Tonight?" "During the cocktail hour, the abbreviated version." He looked at his brother across the room. She already knew some of it. Her father's security team had flagged concerns about the family's background before the engagement. She'd chosen to proceed regardless. "She loves him," Vivian said. "Yes." He was quiet. "She came to me before the ceremony. She said—" He stopped. He said it the way he said things that cost something to say, carefully, with spaces between the words where the weight could be distributed. She said she understood now why Marco was the person he was, and that she was grateful to whoever had made him that way, and that she intended to spend the rest of her life making sure he stayed that way. He paused. "She meant me, I think. Without knowing the specifics of what I'd done, she meant me." Vivian looked at him. She was right. He looked at his wine. Possibly. The methods were not the methods, she said, the intention, keeping him outside the radius of it, keeping him able to be the person he is. She held Lucien's gaze. The methods were imperfect. The intention was right. Those are different columns and they don't cancel each other out. He looked at her for a moment. "You've become very generous in your assessments this week." "I've become realistic," she said. "There's a difference." Something that was not quite a smile moved through his face, but it was the most complete version of it she'd seen from him, which meant it was real, and it was allowing itself to be real without being contained first. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that happens between people who have been in danger together, and on the other side of it have nothing left to perform. "The museum," he said. "I know." She'd been thinking about the museum. "Gerald Forsyth has formally requested my resignation pending a review of my conduct, destroying a donated piece from the collection. He framed it as reckless endangerment of the museum's assets." She paused. "Torres's team has already notified the museum's board that the donated piece was itself acquired through criminal networks, and its donation was an attempt to transfer evidence of illegal activity into a protected institutional setting. The board is currently reconsidering Gerald's framing." "And you?" "I haven't decided yet whether I want the job back," she said honestly. "I've been doing it for 12 years, and I'm good at it, and I love it. But something about this week has made me want to think about what else I might be good at." She looked at the room. "The Federal Art Crime Division doesn't have enough people who understand how these networks operate from the inside. Torres said that tonight, to me, directly. She wasn't being subtle." "She wasn't," Lucien agreed, which confirmed that Torres had said something similar to him, which confirmed that the two of them had been talking about Vivian in a way that should probably annoy her and didn't quite. "I'm not making any decisions tonight," she said. "No," he said. "You've made enough decisions this week." She looked at him. He was looking at the room, at Marco and Elena moving through it, at the particular luminosity of people in the specific hours that surround a marriage, the hours when the choice is new and the weight of it hasn't been distributed yet into the ordinary days that will follow. He watched them with an expression that had, at its foundation, something she recognized as longing, though not the romantic longing of a man watching his brother and wanting the same thing. Something more complex, the longing of someone who has spent a long time arranging for other people to have the things he's protected himself from wanting. "Lucien," she said. "What happens now? With the family? With the organization?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Federal Cooperation Agreement that Carmine has been negotiating, the one we spent Thursday building the foundation for, covers the Moretti organization's historical involvement in the Doyle Alliance and the operations that Vincent ran using our infrastructure. In exchange for full disclosure and material cooperation, The organization receives a supervised transition period, 3 years. Federal oversight on all significant transactions. A compliance officer with real authority. He paused. At the end of 3 years, if the transition benchmarks are met, the organization operates as a legitimate business entity. Vivian absorbed this. 3 years? 3 years? He looked at the floor. It will be different from anything this family has done before. It will require people to change in ways they don't want to change. Some of them will leave. Some of them will be unable to meet the terms. He looked up. But it can be done. I believe it can be done. You could have chosen differently tonight, she said. When the federal agents were at the loading bay, you had enough to give Vincent to the Doyle side and protect the Moretti position entirely. You chose to give them the whole thing. Yes. Why? He looked at her for a long moment. Because the alternative was continuing to exist in the way I've been existing, and I've watched what that costs. He said it simply, without drama, the way people say true things when they've stopped trying to manage how the truth sounds. It costs too much. It costs... He stopped. He started again. It costs the ability to stand in a room with someone without calculating what they know and what they don't and what you can allow them to see. It costs... He looked at her with the specific directness she'd come to understand as his version of being unguarded. It costs the ability to trust someone who has earned it. Vivian looked at him. She thought about the alley. She thought about the car. She thought about 4:15 in the morning at a table covered in documents and a phone in the left pocket, and a man who had arranged the conditions of her involvement without fully disclosing it, and had then told her the truth about it when the truth was inconvenient and she'd needed to know. You withheld things, she said. Yes. Specific things that would have changed my understanding of my situation. Yes. And then you told me. Yes. He looked at her steadily. When you asked. And before that, when I understood that you not knowing was a risk I wasn't willing to take with your safety. She thought about this. She thought about the difference between the people in her life who had withheld things to protect themselves and the people who had withheld things to protect her, and about how the motivation didn't change the fact of the withholding, but did change what it meant about the person doing it. She thought about her father, who had withheld the full weight of what had happened to him because he'd decided she didn't need to carry it, and about the cost of that decision to both of them, and about the fact that she understood why he'd done it, and she'd have preferred he hadn't, and both of those things were true simultaneously. You're going to have to be better at the telling, she said. I know. He said. He said it like a man who actually knows, not like a man performing acknowledgement. I mean, functionally better, not just in principle. I understand the distinction. Good. She looked at her wine. Because if we're going to... She stopped. She started again with more precision. If the arrangement we've arrived at this week is going to be anything more than a week, it requires a different approach than the one you've been using. I was quiet for a moment. The arrangement we've arrived at. That's what I said. You have a very careful way of not saying things. You have no room to comment on that, she said. Something genuinely warm moved through his expression, the kind of warmth that a person who has been careful their whole life allows when they've stopped, momentarily, being careful. No, he said. I don't. She looked at the room. She looked at Marco and Elena. She looked at the white garden roses and the ceiling and the light. And she thought about the museum and the painting and the chain of custody documents and her father and the crates and the specific cost of everything that had happened in the last 6 days. She thought about what she'd been before the painting arrived on a Tuesday and what she was now and the distance between those two things and whether the distance was something that had happened to her or something she'd chosen and decided it was both and that both was fine. I need to go see my father tomorrow, she said. Of course. And I need to pick up my cat. Whoever Soren sent to check on him, Handel is... He does not like strangers. There's a specific way to approach him or he hides under the bed for 3 hours. I'll tell Soren, Lucian said, with the same tone he'd used in the car 4 nights ago when he'd said the same thing, the tone that was learning, incrementally, to accommodate the ordinary texture of another person's life. The approach is slow, she said. You come in low. Let him sniff your hand first. Don't make eye contact initially. For the cat. For the cat. Don't reach for him. Let him decide. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd catalogued without meaning to across a week, The expression of a man encountering something he thought he understood and discovering he doesn't quite. All right, he said. Thank you. She looked at the room. For all of it. The parts you managed well and the parts you managed badly and the parts that were neither. He looked at her. Thank you, he said, for not leaving. She thought about the loading bay. She thought about the fence gap. She thought about the alley and the car and the table covered in documents. She thought about the moment in the terminal when she'd moved through the chaos of light and shadow to photograph the crates, which had not been the move of a neutral party or a civilian caught up in events, which had been the move of a person who had decided what kind of person she was going to be and then been that person. I didn't want to leave, she said. It was the most direct thing she'd said to him, and it sat between them with the specific weight of things that are true and known and now said, which is different from the weight of things that are true and known and not yet said. He didn't say anything in response. He raised his glass slightly, a gesture so small it was almost not a gesture, and she understood it was his version of the same thing, acknowledgement without performance, feeling without announcement. They stood together in the room full of people and roses and the sounds of a celebration, and the night moved around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the silence was the kind that needed nothing added to it. 3 months later, in late January, on a morning when Chicago was doing what Chicago does in January, existing in open contempt of human comfort, wind off the lake like a flat hand, Vivian walked through the conservation wing of a new facility on the north campus of the Museum of Art. The wing was not finished. There were still construction materials in 2 of the treatment rooms, and the climate control systems were being calibrated, and the wall where the director's name would eventually go in bronze letters was still painted over. But the light was right. She'd specified the light through 3 rounds of consultation with the architect and a lighting designer, and it was right, diffuse, directional where it needed to be, with the specific quality that lets you see what's actually there rather than what you expect to see. The wing was named for her father, not for Dominic Hale, art world figure or victim of a criminal conspiracy, but for Dominic Hale, logistics consultant and careful reader of fine print and man who had trusted the wrong people for the right reasons and spent 23 years carrying the weight of it without letting it flatten him entirely. The name had been Gerald Forsyth's idea, which had surprised Vivian until she understood it. Gerald was a man who understood institutional optics, and naming the new conservation wing after a man who'd been exonerated in connection with the museum's own donation scandal was good institutional optics. She'd accepted it anyway, because the motive didn't change what the name meant to her father, who had stood in this room 6 weeks ago while the lettering was being installed and looked at the wall for a long time without speaking, and then said quietly to no one in particular, "Well, how about that?" She was the wing's director. The offer had come from the board after the federal case cleared her name, and it was a better job than the one she'd had, with more authority and more resources and more of the work she actually wanted to do. She'd accepted it. She was good at accepting things that were good. She walked through the second treatment room, checking the humidity readings on the new monitoring system, making notes on a condition report for a piece that had arrived that morning from a museum in Amsterdam, part of an ongoing restitution collaboration that was one of the first formal programs the new wing was anchoring. The piece was a small oil-on panel, 17th century Dutch, unsigned. It had a provenance gap between 1941 and 1988. It had been claimed by the descendants of a family from Utrecht. The claim was documented, the match was solid, and the restitution was proceeding. She'd be part of making sure it got home. She was writing the last line of the condition report when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Lucien, which arrived the way his texts always arrived, without preamble, without throat clearing, direct to the content. He had not substantially changed this about himself, and she had not asked him to, because directness was not a flaw. It just required a specific willingness to be direct back, and she'd been practicing. The text said, Marco and Elena, girl, early, both healthy. Marco cried in the hallway. Told him it was allowed. She stood in the new treatment room with its good light and looked at the text for a moment. She thought about Marco and Elena and a hallway, and a man who was learning, at the beginning of his marriage and the beginning of fatherhood, that the things he'd been protected from knowing had made him more capable of love, not less, because he'd come to it without the armor that knowing requires. She thought about the kind of uncle Lucien Moretti was going to be, which was going to be the kind he'd always been: thorough, deliberate, slightly overwhelmed by the ordinary human texture of it, and completely committed. She typed back, "Tell him it's always allowed. What's her name?" She set the phone down and finished the condition report. The humidity reading was correct. The light was right. Outside the windows, Chicago was being January without apology, and inside the treatment room, everything was controlled and careful and documented, and she was where she was supposed to be, doing the work she was supposed to do. The phone buzzed again. She looked at it. Lucian had written Aldo. They named her Aldo. She looked at the name. She thought about Aldo Moretti, a man she'd never met, who had built a family and an empire and lost the capacity to hold either in the end, whose final months had been managed by a son who loved him and carried the weight of that love in ways that cost him more than he'd been willing to admit. She thought about names and what they carry, what gets handed down through them. Not the bad things, not only, but the continuity of a family deciding to persist, deciding to keep going, deciding that the future they're building is worth naming someone after. She typed back, "Good name." She put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. An hour later, she heard the door of the treatment room open, and she knew the footsteps without looking up. She'd been learning them for 3 months, the particular cadence of someone who moves with deliberate quiet as a default setting, who occupies space as if they've mapped it in advance. She finished the notation she was writing, set the pen down on the clipboard, and looked up. Lucian stood in the doorway. He still wore winter in his face the way he wore most things, present but managed. He had a scarf she hadn't seen before, dark gray, wrapped once and left open at the collar. He looked at the room with the quick thoroughness of a man assessing an environment before relaxing in it. He looked at the monitoring equipment, at the condition report on the clipboard, at the small Dutch panel on the treatment table. He looked at her. "How's the baby?" she said. "Small," he said. Extremely loud for something that small. He came further into the room. He looked at the panel on the table. "New intake?" "This morning. Restitution case from Amsterdam. I'll have the full assessment by end of the week." He stood beside the table and looked at the panel with the careful attention he gave to things he didn't fully understand but was willing to learn. This was also something she'd been learning about him in the 3 months of learning, that he applied the same quality of attention to everything, to threats, to problems, to small Dutch paintings, to her, and that the attention was genuine, not strategic, which was the part she hadn't expected and which had undone, incrementally, a number of the defenses she'd built up over a professional lifetime of not letting anything matter too much. "Vincent's preliminary hearing is next week," he said. "I know, Torres called." She looked at the panel. "I'll testify when they need me." "You don't have to prepare with the prosecution separately. Carmine can—" "I know how to prepare my own testimony," she said. "I know you do." He said it without friction, the way he'd learned to say things she was capable of managing herself without making the saying of it a challenge. She looked at him. He was looking at the panel. The light in the room, her carefully specified light, landed on his face and showed what 3 months had done there. A slight ease in the lines around his eyes, not gone but redistributed. The particular softening that comes when a person has been sleeping more than 4 hours a night with some regularity. He was not a relaxed man, would probably never be a relaxed man, and she was not a person who needed him to be. But he was easier in himself than he'd been in October, in the way something under long-term tension is easier when the tension has been acknowledged, and partly addressed when the carrying has been shared. "I was thinking," he said, still looking at the panel, "about the summer." "What about it?" "There's a restitution conference in Florence in July. The European Art Recovery Consortium. I know you've attended before." He looked at her sideways. "I have business interests in the region that I'll be formalizing as part of the transition process. It might be efficient to coordinate the timing." She looked at him. He was presenting this very carefully, the way he'd learned to present things that were not about business as being partly about business, which was his version of not saying the thing directly before he was sure the thing was welcome. She'd been working on being clear about when things were welcome. "Florence in July," she said. "Or you have scheduling conflicts," he said. "I understand." "I don't have scheduling conflicts in July." She picked up her clipboard. "I'll want to see the conference program. There are 3 sessions I'd prioritize." Something in his face settled. Not dramatically. just the specific settling of something that had been held in suspension and is now allowed to rest. "I'll get the program," he said. She nodded. She looked at the panel and at the provenance gap in the documentation. 1941 to 1988, 47 years of a painting's life that had happened in the wrong hands, that needed to be traced and documented and ultimately closed. She thought about the family in Utrecht who was waiting for this work to come home. She thought about what it meant to something to be returned to where it belonged, not restored to what it was before the damage, because you couldn't restore that, but returned to the people who had the right to it, which was different and still mattered. She picked up her pen and wrote the last line of the condition report, and the new wing settled around her in its careful light. And outside Chicago was still being January, and she was still standing in it, which was, all things considered, exactly where she intended to be. She had broken an irreplaceable thing on a Tuesday night in October to protect what was inside it. She had been right to do it. She had moved through the damage and through the cost of it, and come out the other side with her hands still capable, and her eyes still trained, and her understanding of what she was willing to fight for made larger and more specific than it had ever been in 41 years of careful professional living. She was not the same person who had been at that workbench with a UV lamp. She was the person that person had been becoming without knowing it, made visible by a week that had required her to be exactly that. She closed the condition report. She went back to work.